Silas Varden didn't even look up from his ledger when he said it. Double the rent, starting Monday. Mabel Rourke stood across his mahogany desk, $43 folded in her coat pocket, and watched the wealthiest man in Cinder Ridge sign his name to a number that should have ended everything for her right there. He wasn't angry. That was the worst part. He wasn't even trying to hide what he was doing. He just smiled, the slow, patient smile of a man who had done this before, and slid the paper across the desk like he was doing her a favor. "A woman alone," he said, finally meeting her eyes. "Probably shouldn't have taken on something this size to begin with." Mabel didn't move. Outside, she could hear men laughing near the freight yard. She picked up the paper, folded it once, and put it in her pocket next to her money. She said nothing. But something settled in her chest right then. Not rage, not despair. Something quieter and far more dangerous than either one. If you've ever been told you don't belong somewhere, if someone has ever tried to take from you the one thing you built with your own two hands, stay with me. Because what happened next in Cinder Ridge, Wyoming, in the winter of 1889, will stay with you for a long time. This is the story of a woman who was handed the kitchen nobody wanted. And 6 weeks later, men were riding 40 miles just to sit at her table. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, please subscribe to this channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The autumn of 1889 arrived in Wyoming like a creditor, without warning, without mercy, and without any interest in what you had planned. By the time Mabel Rourke stepped off the freight wagon in Cinder Ridge on a cold Tuesday morning in October, she had been traveling for 11 days. Her back hurt in a way she no longer bothered to describe. Her shoes had developed a split along the left sole that let in cold air with every step, and she had stuffed it with a folded piece of newspaper 3 states ago and hadn't thought about it again because there were larger problems. She was 54 years old. She was a widow. She had $43. She had 1 suitcase, 1 cast-iron skillet wrapped in a flour sack, and one very clear understanding that there was nothing left behind her worth going back to. The house in Missouri was gone, swallowed by debts her husband James had accumulated in the last 2 years of his life. Debts she hadn't fully known about until the bank sent a man in a brown suit to stand on her porch and explain, in a voice that was almost kind, that the property would need to transfer. She'd had 30 days to pack. She'd taken 14. Staying longer would have just meant watching the walls she'd papered herself become someone else's walls, and she didn't have the stomach for that. A neighbor had mentioned Cinder Ridge, said there was work out there, said the settlement was growing, said a woman with a strong back and practical skills could find her footing in a place like that. What the neighbor hadn't mentioned was that Cinder Ridge in October looked like the kind of place that had already made up its mind about you before you arrived. It wasn't unfriendly, exactly. It was just indifferent. A main street of packed dirt and 6 buildings that weren't quite finished, a freight depot that smelled like axle grease and cold iron, a general store with a warped front step, and at the far end of everything, Silas Varden's hotel, a 2-story wood frame building that stood a full foot taller than anything else in town, like it was making a point. The wagon driver, a man named Cooper, who had said maybe 40 words in 11 days, pointed her toward the hotel without being asked. "He owns most of it," Cooper said, meaning Silas, meaning the town. "If you need anything, you'll end up talking to him eventually anyway." Mabel thanked him, picked up her suitcase, and walked toward the hotel. She was not naive about what she was walking into. She had grown up the daughter of a farmer in a place where men owned the land and women managed what the men let them manage. She had spent 31 years married to a man she loved, who was also, if she was being truthful, not particularly good with money. She knew how power arranged itself in small towns. She knew what a man like Silas Varden looked like before she'd ever met one. She just needed somewhere to cook. That was all she had ever been genuinely good at. Not in the way people say they're good at something to be polite, but good in the way that made strangers go quiet at a dinner table and then reach for a second helping before they'd finished thinking about the first. Her mother had taught her. Her grandmother had taught her mother. It was the kind of knowledge that didn't come from a book and couldn't be purchased from a catalog, and it was, as far as Mabel could calculate on that cold October morning, the only remaining asset she possessed. She needed a kitchen. Silas Varden received her in the small office behind the hotel's front desk, and she understood him in approximately 4 minutes. I was 60, maybe 62, with the kind of posture that came from decades of being the tallest tree in a short forest. He was not unkind in any obvious way. He was something more dangerous than unkind. He was certain. Certain that he understood this town. Certain that he understood the freight trade, the land, the weather, the market. Certain, above all, that he understood a woman traveling alone with a suitcase, because he had seen several of them pass through and he knew how their stories ended. He told her what he had available. There was, he said, with a small pause that carried the entire weight of what he actually thought, a kitchen behind the old freight shed on the east end of town. He had been renting it to no one because no one had wanted it. The previous tenant, a man named Grover, who had attempted a bakery, had abandoned it 6 months ago after one winter. He named a price. It was low. That was the first warning Mabel should have heeded and didn't, because low prices on unwanted things are not generosity. They are a statement about what something is worth to the person selling it. But Mabel did not have the luxury of better options, so she said yes, paid 2 weeks in advance from her $43, and walked to the east end of town to see what she'd bought herself. The kitchen behind the freight shed was, to put it plainly, a wreck. The windows were broken. Not cracked, broken, with the remaining glass jagged around the edges and a canvas tarp nailed over the largest pane that had already started pulling away from the nails along the bottom. The stove was a big cast iron range that might have been handsome once, but the firebox door was cracked, and the whole thing sat unevenly on the warped floor. The shelves along the east wall had partially collapsed, leaving 2 of them hanging at angles. There was a smell of old smoke and something else underneath it. Rot, maybe, or just age. The kind of smell a building gets when it's been empty long enough to forget what it was supposed to be. Mabel set her suitcase down. She stood in the middle of the room for a long moment. She looked at the stove, the shelves, the broken windows, the packed dirt floor near the door where the canvas hadn't kept rain from coming in, and she did something that she would not fully understand herself until much later. She laughed. Not from joy, not from madness, but from the sheer absurdity of it. That this was the bottom, that this cold, broken room was the absolute bottom of what her life had become, and that she was still standing in it with her skillet under her arm and $41 left to her name. If this was the bottom, she thought, then at least she knew where she was standing. She took off her coat, rolled up her sleeves, and started examining what could be saved. The walls were sound, thick plank construction, just dirty. The floor was uneven but solid. The stove was fixable, probably. She'd coaxed bad stoves into cooperation before. The shelves needed new brackets and new boards, both of which she could find. The windows she could cover more securely with canvas until she had money for glass. She could work with this. She started cleaning. 3 days in, she had scrubbed the walls twice, resecured the remaining shelves, and swept out enough debris to fill a barrel. She had covered the windows with canvas stretched tight and nailed at every 6 inches. She had reorganized the space so that the stove sat at the center of her workflow. The preparation surface was to the left, and the door was to the right, where she could greet anyone who entered. The stove remained a problem. The firebox door was cracked along the lower hinge, which meant it didn't seal properly, which meant the fire burned unevenly and too much heat escaped. She had tried 3 different arrangements of the damper and none of them corrected it. She could cook on it. She'd proven that with a test batch of cornbread that came out acceptable on one side and underdone on the other. But acceptable wasn't what she was after. She was standing behind the freight shed on the morning of the 4th day, trying to decide whether she had enough money to pay someone to look at it, when she noticed a man watching her from the other side of the alley. He was large, not in a soft way, but in the way of someone whose body had been shaped by physical work over a very long time. Broad-shouldered, somewhere near 50, with a face that had been weathered to the color of old saddle leather. He was holding a coffee cup and leaning against the back wall of what Mabel would later learn was his blacksmith shop, which backed onto the same alley. He had clearly been watching her for some time. "The stove," he said. It wasn't a question. Mabel looked at him steadily. "Firebox door." He nodded, like he'd already guessed that. "Calder Boone," he said. "Mabel Rourke." He set down the coffee cup. "You want me to look at it?" She did want him to look at it. What she didn't have was the money to pay him what the work was actually worth, and she was not in the habit of asking for charity and then failing to deliver something in return. "I can't pay you in cash," she said. Not yet. He seemed to consider this without any obvious reaction, which she noted. Some men would have ended the conversation there. Some would have made a face. Calder Boone just looked at the building for a moment and then looked back at her. "I heard you're setting up to cook," he said. "That's right. I've been eating my own cooking for 6 years," he said, "since my wife passed." There was no performance in how he said it, no bid for sympathy, just a statement of fact delivered in the tone of a man reporting the weather. Mabel understood what he was offering and what he was asking. "You fix the stove," she said, "and I'll feed you supper for every day it takes to fix it, and once a week after that until the debt's cleared." Calder Boone picked up his coffee cup. "I'll start this afternoon," he said. He was back at 2 o'clock with tools. Mabel learned fairly quickly that Calder Boone was not a man who filled silence with words. He worked for 3 hours on the stove that first afternoon, his movements precise and unhurried, and he spoke maybe a dozen sentences total, most of them questions about what specific behavior she'd observed in the fire. She answered each one as precisely as she could, and he nodded and kept working. By evening, the firebox door had been replaced with a heavy iron plate he'd fabricated himself, fitted with new hinges and a catch that closed flush and held tight. He'd also re-leveled the stove on stone pieces he'd brought from the smithy and adjusted the flue connection so it drew cleanly. He built a fire to test it. They both stood and watched the stove. The heat came off it steady and even, filling the small room. Mabel put her hand near the firebox door, feeling the seal hold. She put a pan on the surface and watched it heat evenly across the bottom. She made supper. She made what she had, which wasn't much. Fried potatoes, 2 eggs, dried beef she'd softened in a little water, and cornbread in the cast-iron skillet. But she made it with the kind of attention she gave to everything she cooked. The timing of the oil, the heat of the pan, the moment the eggs needed to come off so they weren't hard. The cornbread pulled from the skillet at the exact second the crust was set, but the interior was still soft. She set a plate in front of Calder Boone. He ate. He didn't compliment the food right away. He just ate with steady, thorough attention, the way a man eats when he is not performing enjoyment but actually experiencing it. When his plate was empty, he sat for a moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "I haven't eaten like that since Eleanor died." Mabel didn't say anything immediately. She poured him coffee. "You're welcome every evening," she said, "until the debt's clear." He nodded. He came back the next evening, and the evening after that. By the end of the first week, Mabel had rebuilt both shelves, hung a proper canvas door that tied back in fair weather, and organized her pantry with the limited supplies she could afford. She had a functioning stove, a clean workspace, and a kitchen that no longer smelled like abandoned years. What she still didn't have was customers. She walked to the general store and spoke with the owner, a man named Pruitt, about posting a simple notice. Pruitt was pleasant enough, said he'd put it by the door. But he said it the way men say things they don't intend to follow through on, and sure enough, the notice was gone the next morning without ever having been properly displayed. She couldn't afford a painted sign. What she had was the stove. On the morning of the 10th day, Mabel made her first calculated decision. She opened her canvas door while she was cooking, really cooking, not just testing, and let the air do the work she couldn't pay for. She fried onions in butter until they were soft and caramelized and the smell came off them in waves. She brewed a full pot of coffee. She put beef on slow from early morning, let it cook down in its own juices with a little molasses and dried herbs until the smell of it drifted through the canvas and out into the alley and down toward the freight road. She didn't call to anyone. She didn't have to. The first man who appeared in her doorway was a freight driver, tall, red-bearded, road-worn, who stopped short when he saw the inside of the kitchen and then said, in a tone of genuine surprise, "Ma'am, are you actually serving food in here?" His name was Lars Fenwick. Mabel told him to sit down. She gave him beef, fried onions, cornbread, and coffee. Lars Fenwick ate everything on his plate and then sat very still for a moment, the way Calder Boone had sat still, and Mabel recognized that stillness for what it was. It was the particular silence of a person who has just tasted something they didn't expect. Lars left her $1.60. The meal had cost her 35 cents to make. "I'll be back Thursday," he said at the door, "and I'll be bringing 2 men with me." Mabel looked at the $1.60 on the rough board table. She thought, there it is. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about Silas Varden's ledger and the number he was already calculating. She didn't know about the winter ahead or what a man with the right amount of money and the wrong amount of pride was capable of doing to a woman who had just started to stand back up. She only knew that she had $41.35, a working stove, and one freight driver who had promised to come back Thursday with company. In Cinder Ridge, Wyoming, in the autumn of 1889, that was enough to begin. But beginning, as Mabel Rourke would learn very soon, has a way of drawing attention you haven't prepared for. And not all of it is friendly. Lars Fenwick came back Thursday with 4 men, not 2. Mabel had prepared for 2. She stood in her kitchen at 11:30 that morning and counted the men filing through her canvas door and felt a cold, quiet alarm move through her that she did not allow to show on her face. 4 men meant she was short on beef and short on cornbread and possibly short on coffee if they all drank the way freight drivers tended to drink it, which was constantly and without limit. She had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision. She pulled the beef from the pot, sliced it thinner than she normally would, and stretched it with a second pot of broth she built fast from the drippings, dried onion, and a handful of barley she'd been saving. She doubled the cornbread batter by cutting the ratio and adding an extra egg. She set the coffee to brew strong enough that half a cup did the work of a full one. None of this was ideal. The beef was thinner than it should have been. The cornbread was slightly denser. The broth was good, genuinely good, because she knew what she was doing with a bone and a pot. But it wasn't what she'd intended to serve. Lars introduced the other men without ceremony. Holt, Davies, a man named Pruitt, who was not related to the general store Pruitt, and a heavy-set driver called Cork, who apparently went by only that name and didn't volunteer another. They sat on the mismatched chairs and one short stool Mabel had collected, and they ate. She watched them the way she always watched people eating her food, not anxiously, but with the careful attention of someone taking inventory. Cork finished his broth in under 4 minutes and then sat looking at the empty bowl with an expression that was almost mournful. Davies ate his cornbread first, which was unusual, and then worked through the beef with methodical concentration. Holt asked if there was any butter for the cornbread, and Mabel said no, and he said that was fine, and then ate 3 pieces anyway. When they were done, Lars leaned back on his chair. It was a chair that did not entirely support leaning back, and it protested audibly, and looked at Mabel with an expression she would come to know well over the following weeks. "How many can you seat?" he asked. Mabel looked at the room. 7, if the stool counts. "You need more chairs." "I'm aware of that." "Cork here builds things," Lars said. "In his off hours. He made the bench seat in my wagon." Cork did not look up from his empty bowl. "I could make you 2 benches," he said. "Seat 3 on each side. Long table, fit 8 comfortably." Mabel looked at him. "What would that cost me?" 6 meals, he said. 3 now, 3 when the benches are done." She said yes. By the end of the following week, Cork had delivered 2 solid pine benches and a table built from freight road lumber that was heavy enough to anchor a small building. He'd also, without being asked, replaced the front legs of 3 of Mabel's unstable chairs with legs that were actually the same length. She fed him 3 meals before the furniture arrived and 3 after, and on the last evening he sat at the new table with his hands around a coffee cup and looked around the kitchen with the careful eyes of a man who builds things and understands space. "You should put a shelf there," he said, nodding at the east wall. "Wide one. Plates on the bottom, cups hanging from hooks above." "I know," Mabel said. "I've been thinking about it." "I could. I'll get to it," she said. Not unkindly, but firmly. She was already carrying enough debts paid in meals, and she needed to know how many she owed before she added more. Cork nodded and finished his coffee and left without another word, which she appreciated. Lars, true to the things she was beginning to understand about him, told everyone he knew. He told them over fires on the freight road, in the yards at either end of his route, in the brief conversations men have when wagons pass going opposite directions. He told them with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has discovered something he considers genuinely important and cannot understand why the entire world doesn't already know about it. He told them the food was the best he'd eaten since leaving Ohio 7 years ago. He told them the coffee was hot and the portions were real, and the woman running the place didn't water down the broth or short the bread. He told them, specifically and repeatedly, about the beef and barley soup. Within 3 weeks of Lars Fenwick walking through Mabel's canvas door, she was serving 10 customers on a good day. On a very good day, 12. The mismatched collection of chairs and Cork's two benches were full by noon, and she was turning people away by 1 o'clock, not because she wanted to, but because she had run out of food. Running out of food was both a problem and a proof. It was a proof that people wanted what she was making. It was a problem because the people she turned away at 1 o'clock drove wagons and talked to other people who drove wagons. And the word spreading along the freight road was not just that Mabel Rourke served good food, it was that you had to get there early or you'd miss it, and there is no more effective advertisement in the world than scarcity attached to quality. She started cooking earlier. She was up before 5, fire built by 5:15, first pot on by 5:30. She learned the rhythms of the freight road well enough to predict roughly how many men would arrive and on which days of the week. Tuesdays were slow. Fridays were her hardest day. Sometimes 15 men by noon, which was too many for her space and not enough of anything she'd prepared. She was making money. Not a lot of money. Not yet. But more than she'd made in any comparable period since before James died. She was covering the rent with room to spare, replacing supplies faster than she depleted them, and beginning to accumulate a small reserve that she kept in a coffee tin behind the stove and tried not to count too often because counting it made her anxious about losing it. Calder Boone had stopped coming every evening. Somewhere around the third week, the informal accounting they'd both been keeping had clearly settled, though neither of them had stated this out loud. He came twice a week now, on Tuesday evenings when the kitchen was quiet and she had time to sit for a moment herself, and sometimes on Sunday mornings when he'd walk over with his own coffee already in hand and sit at the end of the big table while she prepped for the week. He didn't talk much on Sunday mornings. She didn't either. It wasn't uncomfortable. She noticed that he always straightened the bench when he left, pushing it flush to the table. She noticed he drank his coffee without sugar and held the cup in both hands even when the room wasn't cold. She noticed that he sometimes looked at the shelf she hadn't built yet with an expression that suggested he was calculating something, and then looked away without saying anything. She was aware that she noticed these things, and she put that awareness on a high shelf inside herself and left it there. She had enough to manage without adding anything to it. It was on a Tuesday in early November, the kind of cold day that reminded you winter wasn't coming eventually, but was in fact already here and simply hadn't committed yet, that Silas Varden walked into her kitchen for the first time since renting it to her. She had 4 customers at the table, 2 freight drivers she recognized, 1 she didn't, and a young ranch hand who'd come in from the south and looked like he hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days, which she suspected was accurate. She was at the stove when she heard the canvas door move, and she turned, expecting Lars or Calder or Cork, and found Silas Varden standing just inside the doorway in his good wool coat, holding his hat in both hands. He looked around the kitchen with an expression she couldn't immediately read. It wasn't quite surprise. It wasn't quite displeasure. It was something in between, the face of a man whose prediction has been inconveniently wrong and who is not yet ready to admit it. "Mrs. Rourke," he said, "Mr. Varden." She turned back to the stove. "I'll be a moment." She plated the orders she'd been working on, carried them to the table, refilled the coffee cups, and then wiped her hands on her apron and came to stand near the door. "I wanted to see how you were getting on," Silas said. His voice had that particular texture, warm on the surface, something cooler underneath. "Getting on fine," she said. He looked at the table, at the 4 men eating, at the pine benches, at the wide shelf she'd finally built 2 weeks ago with boards she'd purchased herself, and brackets Calder had forged for her at no additional charge, the plates arranged along the bottom, and 6 cups hanging from iron hooks above. "You've made improvements," he said. "The building needed them. I see you've added furniture. I needed to seat people." He nodded slowly, the way a man nods when he's thinking about something other than what he appears to be considering. He looked at the stove, Calder's stove, with its new firebox door and its stone leveling and its clean, even draw, and something shifted in his expression. "I understand Lars Fenwick has been directing freight traffic your way," he said. "Lars eats here," Mabel said. "I can't control where he recommends people stop." "No," Silas agreed pleasantly. "I don't suppose you can." He said a few more things, inquired after the quality of the cooking facilities, mentioned that he hoped she was managing the winter preparation, and then he put his hat back on and left. Mabel stood at the stove and watched the canvas door settle back into place behind him. The ranch hand at the end of the table, who was 17 if he was a day and had apparently been listening to everything, looked up from his plate. "That's Varden?" he said. That's Varden. He looked like he smelled something bad. Mabel poured herself a half cup of coffee. Eat your supper, she said. She had known, in the abstract, that Silas Varden would eventually take notice. She had known it the way you know a storm is building on a horizon, not the exact hour it arrives, but the certainty that it is coming and that the distance between then and now is simply a matter of time. She had hoped for more time. 3 days after Silas's visit, Pruitt at the general store was out of flour. Not low. Out. Completely. Mabel stared at the empty shelf behind the counter and then looked at Pruitt, who was a small, neat man who wore the same brown vest every day and had never in their brief acquaintance been anything but polite to her. And she watched him fold his hands on the counter and say, with visible discomfort, that there had been an unexpected purchase of the entire winter supply. When? She asked. Yesterday afternoon. Who bought it? Pruitt looked at his hands. I'm not really at liberty. Pruitt. He was quiet for a moment. Varden's man came in, he said, very quietly. Bought out the flour, the sugar, the coffee, the dried fruit. Said Varden was stocking up for the hotel. Mabel stood very still. She did the arithmetic in her head, and it was not complicated arithmetic. The hotel dining room had been emptying for weeks. She had heard this from Lars, from Cork, from Calder, who said he'd watched 2 freight wagons turn off the main road and come down her alley on a Thursday evening when they'd previously stopped at the hotel. Silas didn't need winter supplies for a dining room that barely had customers anymore. He needed the supplies out of her hands. She thanked Pruitt. She walked back to her kitchen. She sat at the far end of the big table, the end that Cork had reinforced with an extra crossbeam, and she put her hands flat on the surface and she looked at the room she had scrubbed back to life from nothing, at the shelf she had built herself, at the stove that Calder had repaired, at the canvas door that she'd replaced twice already because Wyoming wind was unkind to canvas. She had 12 freight drivers expecting to eat in the morning. She had no flour, no sugar, no coffee, no dried fruit. She could send a wagon to the next town for supplies, but the next town was 2 days away and the roads were beginning to freeze at night, and the cost of a supply run would take most of what she'd saved in the coffee tin, and that was assuming the next town's store had enough to spare, which was not guaranteed in November in Wyoming. She thought about all of this. Then she got up and went to the pantry to look at what she actually had. What she had was potatoes. A lot of potatoes. She'd bought a 50-pound sack 2 weeks ago because they were cheap and filling, and her customers were men who worked with their bodies all day and needed substance on a plate. She had onions, a full crate of them. Same logic. She had eggs, 12, maybe 20. She had barley, a good amount of it, because barley stretched a broth further than almost anything else she knew. She had beef, a significant quantity, because beef was the one thing she had been deliberately stockpiling. She had molasses, 2 crocks of it. She had salt and pepper and a collection of dried herbs she'd brought from Missouri because she'd known enough to know she couldn't count on finding them. No flour, no sugar, no coffee, no fruit. She stood at the pantry and looked at what she had and she began to think, not panic, not despair. Something more focused than either, the kind of thinking that happens when you remove the options you don't have and start working strictly with what remains. She had made potato cakes before. Not the thin, delicate kind you made when you had plenty. The thick, substantial kind, pan-fried in beef drippings, until the outside was crisp and the inside was dense and filling. Her mother used to make them when money was short. They were not a compromise dish. Made right, they were a genuinely good thing to eat. She had barley and beef, which meant she had stew. Real stew, the slow kind, built from the morning and allowed to develop over hours, so that by noon the broth was so deep and savory that men would reach for the bowl before they reached for anything else. The onions she could roast whole in the coals around the stove's base, a method her grandmother had shown her, where the outer layers blackened and the interior softened and caramelized and became something completely different from what it had started as. The molasses. She looked at the 2 crocks of molasses and thought for a long moment. She could make custard. Not a delicate custard. She didn't have the sugar for that, and she wasn't sure molasses and eggs alone would set the way a custard needed to set. But she'd made molasses pudding before, something between a custard and a dense cake, cooked slow in the back of the stove in small clay pots. And if she got the ratios right with the eggs she had, it would set into something warm and dark and sweet in a way that would feel, after a meal of stew and potato cakes, like an extravagance. She worked until midnight. By the time Calder came by at 7 the next morning, she hadn't asked him to come, but she had a feeling he'd show up, and she was right. She had a pot of beef and barley stew that had been cooking for 11 hours, a bowl of potato cake batter she'd refined through 2 test batches, a pan of roasted onions, and 8 small clay pots of molasses custard cooling on the shelf. Calder stood in the doorway and breathed in and didn't say anything for a moment. "No flour," she said. "No coffee. Varden bought out the supply." He looked at her. "I know," she said, before he could respond. "I know what he did, and I know why. Lars will want to—" "Lars is going to eat his breakfast and drive his wagon," Mabel said. "That's all." Calder was quiet. "I'm not going to let this become a fight," she said. "Not in the open. Not the way he wants it to be." She turned back to the stove and checked the stew. "If I stand here yelling about what he did, I'm the woman who failed. If I stand here feeding people, I'm the woman who didn't." Calder looked at the pots of custard on the shelf. He looked at the potato cake batter. He looked at the stew, which was by that point filling the entire kitchen with a smell that was making it genuinely difficult to think about anything else. "All right," he said. He sat at the end of the table and drank the weak tea she offered in place of coffee, and didn't complain about the tea, which she appreciated more than she said. The first driver through the door at 8:30 was Holt, who stopped just inside the canvas door and said, "Something smells different." "Sit down," Mabel said. "Where's the coffee?" "Supply issue. I have tea." Holt made a face. He sat down. He ate. Mabel watched him through the potato cakes, through the stew, through the roasted onions. She brought out the molasses custard last, setting the small clay pots at each place, and she watched Holt pick up his spoon and look at it with the mild suspicion of a man who doesn't know what he's being given. He ate 1 spoonful. He stopped. He ate another. He looked up at Mabel with the expression of a man who has just been surprised by something he hadn't expected to feel, and Mabel recognized that expression too, had seen it first on Calder's face on the very first evening, and she allowed herself, privately and without showing it, a small moment of deep satisfaction. "What is this?" Holt said. "Molasses custard." He looked at the small pot. "Is there more?" "Not today." He nodded slowly and ate the rest of it with a reverence she found quietly amusing. Lars arrived at 9:30 with Davies and 2 men she hadn't seen before. He walked in, registered the absence of coffee, registered the presence of something on the stove that was making him slow down just inside the door, and then sat without comment. After breakfast, after all of them had finished, after the custard cups were empty, and the stew bowls were clean, and the last of the potato cakes were gone, Lars pushed his cup of tea aside and looked across the table at Mabel. "Varden bought out the supply," he said. It wasn't a question. Mabel said nothing. "Pruitt told me this morning. I ran into him at the freight depot." Lars's voice had changed, had dropped to a register she hadn't heard from him before. "I want to tell every man on this road what he did." "No," Mabel said. "Mabel, no." She said it quietly, but without any give in it. "You're going to eat your meals and drive your route and tell people the food is good. That's what you're going to do. He's trying to starve you out." "He's tried," she said. "It didn't work." She nodded at his empty bowl. "Did it?" Lars looked at the bowl. He looked at her. He was angry in the way of a man who wants to do something and has just been told he can't, and the anger was real, and she didn't dismiss it. "I hear what you're saying," he said more quietly. "I just don't understand it." "I know," Mabel said. "But if you make this into a war, people pick sides. Some of those people do business with Varden. Some of them owe him money. Some of them will side with him just because he's the man they've always sided with." She set her hands on the table. "But if it stays about the food, if it stays about whether a man can get a better meal here or at the hotel, I can win that I know how to win." Lars was quiet for a long time. "You're smarter than he thinks you are," he finally said. "Most people are smarter than Silas Varden thinks they are," she said. "He just hasn't noticed yet." The supply problem didn't resolve itself immediately. She sent word through Calder to a farming family 12 miles out, the Ostroms, who she'd heard about from Cork, and arranged to purchase flour and sugar directly at a price that was higher than the store, but lower than sending a wagon 2 days east. The coffee was harder. She stretched what she had by mixing it with roasted barley grain, a trick she'd learned years ago, and that produced something not quite the same as coffee, but drinkable and hot, which in November in Wyoming was what mattered. She did not serve it without warning people what it was. "It's not real coffee," she told Holt the first morning she put it on the table. He drank it anyway. "It's hot," he said. "That's all I promised." He finished the cup and held it out for more. The days that followed had a particular texture, urgent and difficult, and also, underneath all of it, clarifying in a way that Mabel hadn't expected. The supply crisis had forced her to make things she wouldn't have made otherwise, and two of them, the potato cakes and the molasses custard, were becoming the items men mentioned first when they told others about her kitchen. She hadn't planned that. She had planned nothing about it. She had simply looked at what she had and cooked it as well as she knew how, which was, it turned out, very well indeed. Nell Crowley appeared on a Wednesday morning in mid-November. Mabel had seen her before, a small, sharp-eyed widow of perhaps 60, who lived in a board house at the north edge of Cinder Ridge and kept chickens and a kitchen garden, and was, by general town consensus, not a woman you wanted to argue with. Mabel had exchanged nods with her twice near the general store, and had thought each time that she seemed like someone worth knowing. Nell came through the canvas door at 7 in the morning, before the first customer arrived, and stood just inside and looked at the kitchen with the specific gaze of a woman who has run a kitchen herself and is evaluating another woman's operation. Mabel let her look. "You need help," Nell said. "I'm managing." "You're managing now. By February, you'll be dead on your feet." Nell looked at the stove. "I've got time. My grandson Jasper does too. He's 10, he's strong, and he hauls water for half the street already. I could help you cook in the mornings, and he could run supplies and messages." Mabel looked at her. "What do you want for it?" Mabel asked. "A fair wage when you can afford it. Meals in the meantime." Nell's chin came up slightly. "And I want to learn that custard." Mabel almost smiled. "The recipe isn't secret." "Then we've got a deal." Nell Crowley started the next morning. The arrangement worked better than Mabel had any right to expect, partly because Nell was genuinely skilled, not as instinctively as Mabel, but methodically, precisely, the kind of cook who followed the logic of a recipe like a blueprint and improved it by increments. And partly because Jasper turned out to be exactly what Nell had described. Strong, quick, and apparently incapable of standing still, which in a kitchen context meant that water was always hauled, supplies were always retrieved, and messages were always delivered before Mabel had finished thinking about whether she needed them delivered. Jasper was also, she discovered, deeply interested in everything she cooked. Not in a child's way, not in the way of wanting to eat it, in the way of wanting to understand it. He would stop in the middle of hauling a water bucket and watch her fold the potato cake batter with a particular expression on his face, not blank but alert, like someone filing information away for later. Once, she found him standing at the stove with his hand held flat at stove surface height, not touching it, measuring the heat by feel. "Your grandmother teach you that?" she asked. "She taught me the hands over," he said. "You move faster." "You have to know the stove first," she said. "This one runs slightly hotter on the right side. When you know that, you adjust." He nodded with a seriousness she found unexpectedly touching. She showed him the hot spots on the stove surface. He remembered them. He always remembered things she showed him. By the last week of November, Mabel's kitchen was operating on a rhythm that felt for the first time genuinely sustainable. Nell arrived at 6:30, Jasper at 7. By 8, the stove was fully loaded, the first pots were on, and the kitchen was ready for the day. Mabel moved through the hours with less of the constant triage she'd been performing since October, which meant she had more room to think, which meant the food continued to improve. And the men kept coming. Not just the regular freight drivers now. The circle had widened, ranch hands from camps 15 miles out, a survey crew that had been working east of the ridge, 2 men from the lumber operation that was beginning to establish itself up the northern valley, a cattle buyer who came through once, and then came through again the following week and then again the week after, which was a detour of 20 miles from his usual route. She needed to expand the seating. She was thinking about how to do it, where the second room attached to the freight shed could be opened, whether the wall between was structural or just a partition. When Lars came to her on a Friday afternoon after the lunch service, sat at the empty table, and put both hands flat on the surface in a way that meant he had something to say that he wasn't sure how to begin, She poured him coffee. Real coffee. The Ostrom family had connected her with a supply arrangement she was still negotiating, but the first delivery had arrived Tuesday, and the relief in her kitchen that morning had been palpable. Lars wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at the table. Varden's dining room, he said, had 3 customers this week. Total. Mabel said nothing. His cook quit. Woman named Fraud. Been with him 4 years. Left Monday. Told someone at the freight depot she wasn't going to run a kitchen for a man who... Lars stopped. Well, she had reasons. Mabel sat down across from him. The freighters aren't stopping there, Lars said. Not just because of here. Because the food went bad when Friday left, and also because... He stopped again. There's a story going around about the supply thing. I didn't start it, he added quickly, meeting her eyes. I didn't. But Pruitt apparently told someone, and that someone told someone, and... Mabel looked at her coffee cup. People are angry on your behalf, Lars said, which I know isn't what you wanted. It's not useful, she said. Maybe not. He turned the cup in his hands. But Varden knows. He knows the story's out. And he knows his dining room is empty. A pause. I think you should know that. She thought about Silas Varden sitting in his hotel, that 2-story building that stood a foot taller than everything else in town, built to make a point, eating alone in the dining room he'd built to be the center of everything in Cinder Ridge. She didn't feel satisfied by that image. She had expected to, and she didn't. What she felt was something more complicated, something she turned over in her mind that afternoon while she scrubbed the pots after service. She had not come to Cinder Ridge to defeat Silas Varden. She had come to cook. She had come to survive, and then to do better than survive. And the fact that those 2 goals had put her in opposition to him was not something she had chosen. She was winning by the only measure that mattered to her. Her tables were full. Her supplies were stable. Nell and Jasper were here. Calder came twice a week and sat at the end of the table in a way that had become, quietly and without announcement, one of the fixed things in her week. That should have been enough. She wanted it to be enough. And yet, she lay awake that night longer than she should have, in the small room she'd made for herself in the corner of the freight shed proper, listening to the wind come off the ridge and work at the corners of the building. And she thought about Silas Varden in his hotel, and she thought about what Lars had said. His cook quit. He had 3 customers. He's eating alone. And she thought about the particular loneliness of a man whose power had been the thing that stood between him and ordinary human contact. And she wasn't sure what to do with any of it. She didn't want to feel sorry for him. She was fairly certain she did anyway. The first real snow came on a Saturday night in early December, the kind of snow that arrived without warning and committed fully, 2 feet by morning with more coming down. By Sunday, the road was sealed. The freight wagons weren't moving. Cinder Ridge contracted to itself, the way isolated settlements do when the weather closes in, and Mabel's kitchen became, in the absence of travel, something it had been growing toward without fully arriving at, a place where the people who lived in Cinder Ridge actually gathered. Not just ate, gathered. Men came because it was warm and there was food, but they stayed because there was company, and the company was better than sitting alone in a cold room. She heard conversations at her table she would not have otherwise heard, arguments about the best route to take come spring, stories about families left elsewhere, one very long and convoluted debate between Holt and a rancher named Briggs about whether a particular water source on the East Ridge was on Briggs's land or public territory, which was unresolved when they both left, but which Mabel suspected was somehow more manageable for having been argued over good stew. Jasper sat in his corner during the slow afternoons and watched all of it with those careful eyes. She caught him once, on a Sunday afternoon when the kitchen had mostly emptied, arranging the remaining cups in a row on the shelf with a concentration that made her stop and watch. He wasn't playing. He was ordering something in his mind, working something out, and she left him to it. There were 12 inches of new snow on the ground when Calder came through the door on Tuesday evening that week, and stood just inside and said, without preamble, "Varden's sick." Mabel looked up from the stove. "Fever," Calder said. "His man Hessler mentioned it at the smithy this morning, said Varden's been in bed 2 days. Is anyone helping him?" Calder's expression said the answer before his words did. "Hessler does what he can, but Varden's not a man who made friends." She already knew that. She had known it from the first moment she'd sat across from him in his office. from the way the town arranged itself around his money and his authority, and not around any genuine affection. He had built a position, not a community. Those are very different structures, and when one of them fails, it fails alone. She stood at the stove for a moment. Then she began to think about what she had in the pot. She stood at the stove for a long moment after Calder said it, long enough that the ladle she was holding dripped twice onto the floor, and she didn't notice. Varden was sick. Alone in that big hotel with only Hessler, a man who worked for wages, not from care, and no one else coming by. 2 days already. Fever in December in Wyoming was not a minor thing. The cold that came off the ridge at night was the kind that got into a building no matter how well it was sealed, and if a man was already burning from the inside, that cold had a way of deciding the outcome before anyone had made a decision about intervention. She knew all of this. She also knew what Silas Varden had done to her supply line. She knew he had stood in her kitchen with that pleasant, assessing look, and then walked back to his hotel and sent his man to buy out everything she needed before she could reach it. She knew that he had raised her rent the moment he understood she was succeeding, not because he needed the money, but because he needed her to fail. She knew these things with the same clarity she knew the hot spots on her stove, which was to say, completely and without any ambiguity at all. She put the ladle down. "I'm going to make a broth," she said. Calder, who had been watching her face with the careful attention he gave most things, said nothing for a moment. Then, "Tonight?" "Tonight." She moved to the pantry. "Chicken. I've got a stewing hen I've been saving. Barley, carrots, the last of the fresh parsley." She pulled the hen out, set it on the preparation surface, and began working. 2 hours, maybe a little more. "It's past 8, Calder said. "I'm aware of that." "The snow's bad." "I know where he lives, Calder. It's 4 streets. He was quiet. She heard him shift on the bench behind her, that particular sound of a large man adjusting his weight on a wood surface that was not entirely built for men of his dimensions. "You want company," he said. It was not quite a question. "I can walk 4 streets in the snow." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him over her shoulder. He was sitting very still with his hands on the table and his eyes on her, and there was nothing demanding in his expression, just a straightforward willingness to be wherever she needed him to be. And she found, somewhat to her own irritation, that this was a difficult thing to look at directly. "Yes," she said. "If you're willing." "I'll wait," he said. She put the hen on. The broth took 2 hours and 20 minutes. She built it the way she built everything she cared about, without rushing, letting each element come in at the right time. The hen first with cold water that she brought slowly to temperature, skimming carefully 3 times before she added the vegetables. Then the barley in the last 40 minutes. Then the parsley pulled from the pot before it went bitter. The kitchen filled with a steam that was clean and savory and deeply warming, and Calder sat at the end of the table reading an almanac he'd brought from somewhere and not talking, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate about him with an intensity that occasionally alarmed her. She packed the broth into her largest crock, a heavy stoneware piece that held heat for hours, and wrapped it in a doubled flour sack. She wrapped a loaf of bread from the afternoon's baking in waxed cloth. She'd made a dried apple pie that day, and she stood looking at it for a moment and then wrapped half of it without entirely deciding to. Calder was already standing when she turned around, his coat on, her old, oversized coat, the one she wore for outdoor work, held out for her. She put it on. It came to her mid-calf. She didn't remark on this, and neither did he. They walked. The snow was serious, past her ankles and still coming down, and the wind off the ridge had an edge that made it difficult to keep her face forward. She carried the crock. Calder carried the bread and the pie, and also, at one point when she slipped slightly on a patch of ice under the snow, her elbow, which he held until she had her footing back and then released without comment. Silas Varden's hotel was lit in only 2 windows, the front room downstairs and 1 room on the upper floor. The rest of the building was dark. 3 months ago, Mabel thought, that hotel had been the only lit building in Cinder Ridge worth noticing. Now it looked like what it had become, a large structure with very few people in it. She knocked. Hessler answered, a thin, 50-ish man with red-rimmed eyes that suggested he'd also not been sleeping well. He looked at Mabel, then at Calder, then at the crock in Mabel's arms, and his expression moved through several things in quick succession before settling on something she couldn't entirely name. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. How is he? Hessler stepped back from the door. Not good. Fever broke this afternoon, but it was high. He hasn't been eating. He looked at the crock again. He won't like that you came. I know, Mabel said. Can I come in? Hessler let them in. The hotel lobby was cold in a way that buildings get when the fires haven't been tended properly for several days. Not freezing, but with a chill that settled at floor level and climbed your legs. There were 2 chairs near the front window and a lamp on the desk, and not much else showing signs of recent life. The dining room to the right was dark. Mabel looked at the dining room doorway as she passed it, the empty tables, the chairs pushed in, and felt something she had not expected to feel, which was a particular sadness that was not pity exactly, but was adjacent to it. Hessler showed her upstairs. Silas Varden was in a chair near the window in what was presumably his personal room, wrapped in a blanket, and looking considerably less like the man who had sat across from Mabel in his office in October and slid a doubled rent across the desk with a pleasant smile. It was pale and diminished in a way that illness does to people who are normally very certain of their own solidity, and he looked up when she came through the door with an expression that moved from recognition to something very close to shame. Before settling on the stubborn neutrality of a proud man receiving charity he has no grounds to refuse. Mrs. Rourke, he said. His voice was rough. Mr. Varden. She set the crock on the table near his chair without asking permission. I brought broth, chicken and barley. It's still hot. He looked at the crock. He looked at her. He said nothing. She unpacked the bread. She set it beside the crock. I don't need, he started. You haven't been eating, she said. Hessler told me. She found a bowl on the dresser, ladled broth into it, and set it on the arm of his chair. You don't have to talk to me. You don't have to thank me. But you should eat that. Silas Varden looked at the bowl of broth for a long moment. Then he picked it up and drank. She stayed long enough to make sure he finished the bowl and half the bread. She refilled the bowl once. She left the crock, the remaining bread, and the half pie with Hessler, along with instructions that were simple and clear. Broth twice more tonight, bread whenever he'd take it, the pie in the morning if the fever stayed down. Hessler looked at her with an expression that she thought might have been the beginning of something he didn't know how to say, and she saved him from trying by simply nodding and going back downstairs. Calder was waiting in the lobby. He'd gotten one of the chairs near the front window and built the fire in the lobby hearth up to something that was actually warming the room. I was sitting with his hands on his knees looking at the fire when she came downstairs, and he looked up at her and didn't ask how it went. Ready, she said. They walked back through the snow. She didn't speak for most of it, neither did he. When they reached her kitchen door, she'd left the stove banked low, and the room held a residual warmth that hit her when she opened the door, like something she'd forgotten she needed. He stopped at the threshold the way he usually did, not coming inside unless he was invited, which was a thing about him she'd noticed early and hadn't forgotten. Thank you, she said, for coming with me. Of course, he said. He looked at her for a moment, just a moment, in the dark, with snow still coming down around the edges of the canvas door. And then he said goodnight and walked back down the alley toward the smithy. Mabel went inside. She sat at the end of the big table with her coat still on and her hands around a cold cup of tea that she'd left there before she went out, and she sat there for several minutes without moving. She didn't know what she had done tonight or why exactly she had done it. She told herself it was because she fed hungry people, which was true. She told herself it was because Silas was sick and no one else was going, which was also true. She told herself it had nothing to do with the complicated and inconvenient awareness that had been building in her since October, that she and Silas Varden were, in some way she couldn't entirely dismiss, the same kind of person, solitary, proud, certain of their own methods, and deeply wrong about what those methods would cost them. She did not find these thoughts particularly comfortable. She took off her coat, banked the stove for the night, and went to bed. The next morning, she was up at 5, as always, and by 5:30 the kitchen was running, and by the time Nell arrived at 6:30 with Jasper trailing behind her carrying a basket of eggs from her hens, the stew was on, and the potato cake batter was ready, and the kitchen smelled like it always smelled on mornings when things were going right. You look tired, Nell said, not unkindly. I'm fine. Nell looked at her for a second longer than necessary, and then looked at the stove. Broth's gone, she said, noting the empty spot where the big crock usually sat. I took it out last night. Nell nodded slowly. To Varden, she said. It wasn't a question. Mabel didn't ask how she knew. Nell Crowley knew most things in Cinder Ridge before they were officially known. It was simply a fact about her, like the way she held a knife slightly differently than most people, or the way she could tell when bread was done by the smell alone without opening the oven. I heard he's sick, Nell said. She picked up a spoon and began stirring the stew with the practiced authority of a woman who has no problem taking over someone else's pot when it needs stirring. I also heard he's alone up there. He has Hessler. Hessler's not kin. Neither am I. Nell stirred the stew. No, she agreed. But you went. Mabel said nothing. I'm not criticizing, Nell said, and the directness of that statement, no softening, no performance, was one of the reasons Mabel had come to value her. I think it was the right thing. I just think it's going to confuse people. It's going to confuse people that I brought broth to a sick man? It's going to confuse people that you brought broth to that particular sick man, Nell said. She wasn't wrong. By midday, Mabel could tell by the particular quality of the silence at her table, the kind of silence where people are thinking things and not saying them, that the story had moved through Cinder Ridge with its usual speed. Lars arrived at 11 and didn't mention it directly, but had a look about him that suggested he was restraining himself. Cork came in at noon and sat at the far end of the bench and studied his potato cakes with the concentration of a man pretending he hadn't heard something. It was Holt who finally said it. He was 3/4 through his stew when he set his spoon down and looked at Mabel with the expression of a man who has decided that indirect communication is wasting everyone's time. You went to Varden's last night, he said. I did, Mabel said. Why? Because he was sick and not eating. Holt considered this. Around the table, 3 other men were studiously attending to their plates. The man tried to put you under, Holt said. I know. He bought out your supply, doubled your rent. He was trying to starve you out. I know all of that. And you brought him broth. I brought him broth, she said. Holt looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up his spoon and went back to his stew. Well, he said into the bowl, I don't understand it. You don't have to, she said. And then, because she didn't want it to end there, she added, but while we're on the subject, any man at this table who says something cruel about Silas Varden being sick is not welcome at this table anymore. The silence that followed was different from the silence before, heavier. She let it sit. You mean that? Cork said from the end of the bench. I mean it. Cork looked at the table. He looked at his plate. He had the look of a man who had been on the verge of making exactly the kind of comment she'd just prohibited and was now quietly reconsidering. Fair enough, he said. And that was that. The fever didn't return. Hessler sent word through Jasper, who had apparently established himself as the town's most reliable message carrier without anyone formally assigning him that role, on the 3rd morning that Varden was on his feet and had eaten breakfast. Jasper reported this with the tone of someone delivering official news, which made Nell smile into the pot she was stirring. Mabel got the crock back 4 days later. Hessler brought it himself, along with the waxed cloth that had wrapped the bread, and the pie dish, all washed. He knocked at the kitchen door in the mid-afternoon when the service was done and the kitchen was quiet, and he held the items out to Mabel with both hands in a posture that communicated something he clearly didn't have a specific vocabulary for. He wanted me to say thank you, Hessler said. Tell him he's welcome. Hessler nodded. He looked like he might say something else. Then he simply nodded again and left. Calder was at the far end of this table that afternoon. He'd been in and out twice that day, helping Cork reinforce the wall between the kitchen and the adjacent freight shed room, which Mabel had finally decided to open into additional seating. He looked up when Hessler left, and then looked at Mabel with the steady, quiet attention that was simply his way of being present. He sent the dishes back, Calder said. He did. Washed. Yes. Calder looked at the wall he'd been working on, which had a section of planking removed and a rough opening taking shape where Mabel needed the door. He picked up his hammer. That's something, he said, and went back to work. The expansion into the 2nd room took 9 days. Calder and Cork did most of the structural work. The door cut, the additional framing, a proper wooden door salvaged from a building that had been abandoned at the far edge of the settlement. Mabel did the fit out herself: shelves, hooks, the arrangement of tables, the planning of traffic flow so that the servers, which was to say herself and Nell, and occasionally Jasper when service got heavy, could move between the kitchen and both rooms without colliding. She now had seating for 22 people. She was full by noon on the day she opened the second room, and she had to turn 4 men away at 1:30, and she stood at the back of the kitchen after the last customer left and looked at the empty tables. 22 places, all of them recently occupied, the dishes stacked for washing, the smell of the day's cooking still warm in the air, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since arriving in Cinder Ridge. She felt like she was going to be all right, not just surviving, not just managing, actually genuinely going to be all right. She didn't say this to anyone. She turned back to the dishes. It was Jasper who first brought her the news about the wagon. He came in one afternoon in the third week of December, still wearing his coat, his face wind-scoured from the cold, and said in the serious tone he used for things he considered important, "There's a wagon coming from Harmon's Crossing. The driver says he came special." Mabel looked up from the bread dough she was working. "Special how?" "He said he heard there was a woman cooking at Cinder Ridge worth traveling 40 miles for." Jasper said it like he was reading from a document. "He said his name is Galt, and he's got 4 men with him." Mabel looked at her bread dough. 40 miles. She was aware of what that number meant. It was the kind of distance that required a specific reason, the kind of reason that meant someone had spoken to someone who had spoken to someone else, and the story had traveled beyond the immediate reach of Lars Fenwick's freight route into territory she hadn't anticipated. "Tell him to come in," she said, "and tell him there's a wait." Jasper was already gone before she'd finished the sentence. Galt and his 4 men filled the last of the remaining seats in the second room, and Mabel watched them from the doorway of the kitchen, trail-worn, hungry, in the way of men who had been eating their own camp food for weeks, looking around the room with the expression of people who have arrived somewhere they didn't entirely believe would be what they'd been told. She sent Nell out with coffee first, real coffee, then the potato cakes, then the stew, then the roasted onions. Then, because she had made a fresh batch the previous evening, the molasses custard. She was washing a pot in the kitchen when she heard it. Not words, not conversation, but the particular change in the quality of the sound coming from the second room, that shift from the noise of hungry men eating to something quieter and more focused. She had heard it before, at her own table, starting on the very first evening with Calder. She knew what it meant. She dried her hands. Galt appeared in the kitchen doorway 10 minutes later, hat in hand, a weathered man of perhaps 55 with a permanent squint from years of road glare and an expression of someone who has something to say that he's still deciding how to say it. "Ma'am," he said. "Did you get enough?" Mabel asked. "More than enough." He turned his hat in both hands. "I want you to know I wasn't sure this was worth 40 miles. I understand. I was wrong." He said it plainly, without performance. "I'll be telling people." "I appreciate that," she said. He nodded and put his hat back on and went back to his men, and Mabel heard them talking in the second room. The specific, purposeful conversation of men planning logistics, which route, which day, how long the detour would add to the run. And she understood that something had shifted, that the 40-mile story was no longer just a story, but a real fact that would replicate itself and bring more people in its wake. She needed more chairs. She was thinking about the chairs when Nell came back through the kitchen door with a stack of empty custard pots, and the look of a woman who has been thinking about something for several hours and has finally decided to say it. "We need another stove," Nell said. Mabel looked at her. "Not today, but by February, when the survey crews come back through and the spring freight starts early, we're going to need another stove or we're going to lose an hour of capacity every service." She was right. Mabel had been thinking the same thing for 2 weeks and hadn't said it because another stove meant significant money and significant installation and a conversation with Calder that she hadn't quite brought herself to initiate. "I know," Mabel said. "Calder could do it," Nell said, with the careful neutrality of a woman who has made a decision not to editorialize. "I know he could." Nell stacked the custard pots and said nothing else. Mabel spoke to Calder about the stove that Tuesday evening. She laid it out practically. What she needed, what the installation would require, what she could pay, and on what timeline. And Calder listened with his hands around his coffee cup, and asked 3 specific questions about the flue configuration she was planning, and then said he'd look at the second room's east wall and figure out the best approach. He came back the next morning and looked at the east wall and said he could have a second stove in and functional within 2 weeks, and that the flue work would run through the roof without disturbing the existing chimney if they angled it correctly. And he was already measuring when he said it, which meant he'd spent some time thinking about it before coming back. She paid him in cash this time. She had cash. The second stove went in on the 19th of December, 2 days before the storm. The storm that came was not ordinary. She had heard people in Cinder Ridge talk about bad winters, the way people who have lived through something talk about it, with a specific vocabulary of calibration, of comparison, of that was bad, but not like 63 or 63 was nothing compared to the one before the railroad came through. She had cataloged these conversations without full context for what they were describing, because she had not yet experienced a Wyoming winter of the kind they were referencing. She understood now. It began on the evening of the 21st, clouds that came in fast off the northern ridge, and dropped a temperature that had been merely cold into something that was fundamentally different in character. A cold that had a weight to it, that pressed against the building's walls and found every imperfection in the construction and worked at it. Snow came not long after, and then wind, and the combination of the two turned the world outside Mabel's kitchen into a white-gray wall that was impossible to see through. By morning of the 22nd, the road was sealed. Not just difficult, sealed. The drifts against the freight shed were chest-high and still building, and the temperature outside was something she didn't have an instrument to measure, but which communicated itself perfectly clearly through the walls of the building, which were good walls. She had seen to that, but not invulnerable. She kept both stoves burning high. Lars was stuck in Cinder Ridge. So were Cork, Holt, Briggs the rancher, the 2 men from the lumber operation, and a rotating assembly of townspeople who found their way to her kitchen through the snow and stayed because the kitchen was warm and the food was hot and there was company. Calder was there most of the day. She was honest with herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts, about what that meant to her, about what it had been meaning to her for some weeks now, in a way she had been systematically failing to not notice. She was 54 years old, and she had been a practical woman for all of those years, and she had made her peace long ago with the idea that some things in life had a season, and the season ended. She had loved James. The season had ended. That was a fact she had arranged in herself like furniture, arranged in a room. Present, fixed, not going anywhere, but not something she had to walk into every day either. She had not anticipated Calder Boone. She had not anticipated the particular quality of his attention, which was so different from being looked at that she had difficulty sometimes understanding why it felt different, only that it did. She had not anticipated that a man who spoke approximately 40 words an hour could communicate, through those 40 words and the silences around them, a clearer sense of his own character than most men managed in an hour's conversation. She had not anticipated that the sound of him at the far end of the table on a Tuesday evening would become something she noticed the absence of when it was absent. She had not anticipated any of it, and she was not entirely sure what to do with it, and in the meantime she had 2 stoves and 22 seats and a storm outside and 15 people in her kitchen who needed feeding, so she fed them. On the second day of the storm, when the temperature had dropped further and the wind was making a sound against the walls that Jasper described, accurately, as the sound of something very large being angry, Lars said something at the lunch table that silenced the room. "Varden's still up there alone." Nobody said anything. "Hessler went home to his family on the 20th, Lars said. "Before the storm hit. I saw him leave. Varden sent him. Said he didn't need tending." Lars turned his coffee cup in his hands. "That was 2 days ago." Mabel was at the stove. She was aware that the room had gone quiet in the specific way rooms go quiet when everyone is thinking the same thing and waiting to see who says it first. "He has supplies," Cork said. "He's got a full hotel kitchen." "He's been sick," Nell said, from the corner carefully. "He was sick," Cork said. "He's better now." "He was sick 3 weeks ago," Nell said, "in a cold winter." Mabel set down the ladle. "Someone should check on him," Jasper said from his corner. He said it the way he said most things, directly, without apparent concern about whether it was his place to say it. He was 10 years old and he had, over the past month, apparently decided that Mabel's kitchen operated on a principle of practical honesty and that he was a participant in it. Nobody argued with him. The table was quiet. Lars was looking at Mabel. Cork was looking at the table. Nell was looking at the wall and pretending she wasn't listening. Holt, who had been silent throughout, said, "You can't go out in this." "It's 4 streets," Mabel said. "It's 4 streets in a storm that's killed livestock." "Livestock stand outside," she said. "I have a coat." "Mrs. Rourke, I have 2 coats," she said. She looked at Calder. He was already standing up. She packed quickly. The remaining chicken broth from the morning service, bread, the heel of a hard cheese she'd been saving, and, almost as an afterthought, because she had made it 2 days ago and it had been sitting, the second half of a dried apple pie. She was aware, wrapping the pie, that she was repeating a gesture, and that there was something in the repetition that was both deliberate and not fully examined, and she left it unexamined. "I'll be back in an hour," she told Nell. Nell looked at her. "Take the rope," she said. "Cork brought one in yesterday. If the wind's bad, you tie it to something you can find on the way back." Cork, without being asked, got up and tied one end of the rope to the leg of the stove. He handed Mabel the rest of it coiled. She didn't argue. She looped it over her shoulder. They went out into the storm. It was worse than she'd expected, not the snow itself, which was heavy but manageable, but the wind, which came in unpredictable gusts that hit like a physical thing and made it impossible to keep a straight line of direction. Calder walked slightly ahead of her and to the left, breaking the worst of it, and she followed the path his body cleared with her head down and the rope playing out behind her. 4 streets had never taken so long. The hotel was dark in the lower windows when they arrived. One window on the upper floor showed a dim light, a single lamp, turned low. Mabel knocked, then knocked harder, then waited. The door opened. Silas Varden stood in his own doorway in the oversized wool robe of a man who had not fully dressed in some days, and he looked at Mabel and Calder standing on his front step with snow on their shoulders and a rope coiled over Mabel's arm, and whatever he had been expecting, it was not this. He looked terrible, not sick the way he'd looked 3 weeks ago, not feverish, but diminished in a different way. The particular diminishment of a man who has spent too many days alone in a cold building with too many hours to think and not enough reason to get up. "Mrs. Rourke," he said. His voice came out rough. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or something else. "You should have a fire going," she said. "I have a fire." "You have a lamp," she said. "That's not the same thing. Let us in." He stepped back from the door. The lobby was cold, colder than the first time she'd been here, with the fire completely out in the hearth and the temperature in the room several degrees below what it should have been. Mabel looked at the dead hearth, and then at Calder, who was already moving toward it. She went to the kitchen. The hotel kitchen was substantial, larger than her own, with a range that had been well maintained and supplies that were, as Cork had said, adequate. She built a fire in the range and put the broth on immediately. She found dishes, good dishes, the hotel's proper service, and laid out bread, cheese, the pie. She found coffee in the larder and made a full pot. When she came back out to the lobby, Calder had the hearth burning properly, and the temperature in the room was already beginning to shift. Silas was in the chair nearest the fire, wrapped in the wool robe. His hands around a cup of coffee Calder must have poured from some existing pot in the kitchen. He looked up at her. She sat down in the other chair. The fire crackled. The wind worked at the building's corners. Somewhere in the upper floors, a shutter was loose and banging intermittently against its frame with a sound like something trying to get in. "You didn't have to come," Silas said. "I know. It's bad out there." "I know that too." He looked at the fire. His jaw worked slightly, the way jaws work when a person is choosing words with a care that comes from something other than normal social management. "I raised your rent," he said, because I saw what you were building and I knew what it meant for mine." Mabel didn't say anything. "I bought out the supply because I thought—" He stopped. Tried again. "I thought if I made it hard enough, you'd give up. Go somewhere else." He looked at his hands. "I've done that before. With other people. Smaller problem, easier to fix." "I know," she said. "I didn't think—" He stopped again. "You didn't think I'd stay," she said. "No." He looked at the fire. "I didn't think you'd stay." Calder was somewhere in the back of the lobby, giving them the silence they needed, which was a thing Calder did naturally and without being asked, and which Mabel noted with the kind of noticing she was getting better at not suppressing. "Why did you?" Silas asked. "Come tonight. You didn't have to. You had no reason to." She considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and decided to give him the simpler version of it, which was also true. Because I feed people who are hungry, she said. That's what I do. It doesn't have conditions. Silas Varden was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. The wind pushed at the walls. The loose shutter banged. I owe you a debt, he finally said. You owe me nothing, she said. Eat something, that's all. She got up and brought him the broth, the bread, the cheese, and a plate of the apple pie, and she set them on the table beside his chair, and she sat back down and watched the fire while he ate. Outside, the storm continued without any particular interest in what was happening inside the hotel. Storms having no investment in human reckonings, no stake in whether a proud man finally said something true or whether a practical woman chose, for the third time, to cross the distance between what was easy and what was right. But it was happening. And in Cinder Ridge, Wyoming, in the deepest night of that December storm, something shifted between these two people that had no name yet and didn't need one. The storm held for 4 more days. Mabel knew this because she counted them the way she counted everything that mattered. Not obsessively, but with the practical attention of someone who understood that time was a resource the same as flour or firewood, and wasting it on inaccuracy was a form of carelessness she couldn't afford. 4 days of sealed roads, of drifts that made the alley behind her kitchen disappear entirely, of both stoves burning from before 5 in the morning until well past 10 at night. 4 days of her kitchen being the warmest place in Cinder Ridge. People came in shifts. The freight drivers who were stuck in town, Lars, Holt, Cork, Davies, had found somewhere to sleep. Various arrangements in the boarding house or the hotel's upper rooms that Silas had apparently opened without announcement or ceremony sometime on the second day of the storm. They ate at Mabel's in the morning and at midday, and sometimes in the evening too, if the afternoon service had anything left. The rancher Briggs came in from wherever he'd been sheltering and sat at the far end of the second room for 3 hours one afternoon drinking coffee and not saying much, which Mabel understood as a man processing something he wasn't ready to name. 2 women from the north end of town, wives of men who worked the lumber operation, came in together on the third day, sat at the bench nearest the kitchen door, and ate with the quiet, focused gratitude of people who had been managing on diminished supplies. Mabel fed all of them. She ran short on beef twice and stretched it with more barley, and didn't mention the stretching to anyone, and either nobody noticed or nobody said so. She ran through her molasses on the third day and replaced the custard with a simpler egg pudding that was not as good but was hot and sweet and came out of the small clay pots the same way, which she suspected mattered more than the specific taste. She never ran short on bread because Nell was a more methodical bread baker than she was, and had begun doubling the batches 3 days in without being asked. Nell had a quality Mabel had come to think of as strategic generosity. She did things not because she was told, but because she'd looked at the situation from 2 days ahead and understood what would be needed. It made her invaluable in a way that was distinct from skill. Plenty of people had skill. Fewer people could see around the corner of what was coming and prepare for it without drama or announcement. Jasper, for his part, had become a small fixed point of the kitchen's operation. He hauled water, carried messages, stacked wood beside both stoves, and was capable of moving through a crowded room with a full coffee pot without spilling it, which was more than could be said for some adults. He had also, somewhere in the previous 2 weeks, begun arriving before Nell at 6:15, sometimes 6, and starting the water heating without being asked. Mabel had noticed this and said nothing about it because the moment you made a thing official, it sometimes became a thing the person felt they could renegotiate, and she preferred it to remain simply what it was, a 10-year-old boy who had decided this kitchen was his. She paid him on the 4th day of the storm. Not a meal, actual money, a real wage, counted out carefully and placed in his palm. He looked at the coins with an expression she couldn't entirely categorize. "That's yours," she said, "for the week." He closed his fingers around it. He didn't say thank you, which she didn't need. What he did instead was look up at her with those careful, cataloging eyes and say, "Is the kitchen going to keep going after winter?" "Yes," she said. He nodded, as if this confirmed something he'd already decided, and went back to hauling water. Calder was there for the first 2 days of the storm's worst stretch, and then less present on the 3rd and 4th days, which she understood. His smithy was its own operation with its own needs, and a hard freeze was not a period when a blacksmith could simply stop working. He appeared at supper time on the 3rd evening, ate quickly, and left with the distracted look of a man working through a problem he hadn't solved yet. On the fourth evening, he didn't come at all, which was the first Tuesday evening he had missed since they'd made their original arrangement back in October. She noticed his absence with a clarity that she found mildly annoying. Not because she expected him to be there, she had no claim on his time and had never pretended otherwise, but because the shape of the Tuesday evening had arranged itself over the previous weeks around a particular presence at the end of the table, and the absence of that presence created a gap in the evening that was real and specific, and not something she could talk herself out of noticing. She washed the pots after service. She banked both stoves for the night. She sat at the end of the big table with a cup of tea and the almanac Calder had left behind some weeks ago and had apparently forgotten about, and she read 3 pages without absorbing any of them. She put the almanac down. She was 54 years old, she reminded herself. She had arrived in this town with $43 and 1 skillet and nothing left behind her, and in the intervening weeks she had built something real from the shell of a ruined kitchen, and that was what mattered. That was what she had come here for. Calder Boone was a good man who had helped her when she needed help, and his presence in her kitchen on Tuesday evenings was a pleasant thing, and the fact that she noticed his absence tonight was simply an indication that she was a human being with the normal responses of a human being, not a signal of anything that required management or decision or any kind of naming. She was very persuasive when she talked to herself. She also didn't entirely believe it. The storm broke on the morning of the 5th day. It didn't break gradually. Wyoming weather rarely bothered with gradations. It simply stopped, the way a held breath stops when the tension releases. And the morning of the 26th of December arrived clear and cold, and extraordinarily still, with a sky that was the particular deep blue that appears only when the air has been scoured clean of everything and the sun is returning to a world it has just been reminded to take seriously. The freight road was buried. It would take 2 or 3 days of clearing and packing before wagons could move through with any confidence. But the footpaths between buildings had been walked enough during the storm that they were passable, and by mid-morning people were moving through Cinder Ridge with the specific, purposeful energy of people who have been confined and are now released. Lars arrived at the kitchen at 9:30, with his coat still carrying snow from where he'd apparently walked through a drift that hadn't been cleared yet, and he sat at the bench and accepted coffee and looked out the window at the clear sky with the expression of a man calculating time. 3 days, he said, meaning the road. That's what I heard, Mabel said. Maybe 2 if Briggs lets his men work the south end. He drank the coffee. You holding on all right? Supply? Managing. I can get a message to the Ostrom place once the paths are clear. See about a resupply run. That would help, she said. He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. He had the look of a man who came in with 2 purposes and has handled the practical one and is now approaching the other. Varden came out this morning, Lars said. Mabel looked up. Walked to the freight depot. I saw him through the window of the boarding house. Talked to a couple of the men who'd been sheltering there. Lars turned his cup. He looked different. Different how? Lars thought about this with more care than he usually applied to descriptions of people. Like a man who's thought about something for 4 days, he finally said, and didn't like what he decided. Mabel thought about the hotel lobby in the storm's darkness, the dead hearth, the man in the oversized robe who had said, in a voice roughed down to something less than his usual register, I raised your rent because I saw what you were building and I knew what it meant for mine. That's not necessarily a bad thing, she said. No, Lars agreed. I guess it's not. He finished his coffee and left, and Mabel went back to the morning prep with the particular quality of thought that comes when you're waiting for something to happen, and you're not entirely sure what form it's going to take when it does. What happened was not what she expected. The next morning, the 27th, the road still clearing, Silas Varden walked into her kitchen at 10:30. Not the casual reconnaissance visit of early November, when he'd stood in the doorway with his hands in his coat and looked around like a man assessing damage. He came in fully this time, closed the canvas door behind him, actually held it, and closed it against the wind, which was a small thing that was not small, and stood inside the room with his hat in his hands. The kitchen was mid-service. 5 men at the tables, Nell moving between the kitchen and the second room, Jasper refilling coffee cups with the solemnity of someone performing an important task. Everyone in the room registered Silas's presence in the particular way people register unexpected arrivals. A pause, a recalibration, a collective decision about whether to acknowledge or ignore. Mabel was at the stove. "Mrs. Rourke," Silas said, "I was hoping to speak with you, when you have a moment." "Get yourself coffee," she said. "I'll be a moment." She finished what she was doing, plated 2 orders, carried them out herself because Nell's hands were full, and came back and poured herself half a cup of coffee, and stood at the preparation surface and looked at Silas Varden. He had his coffee. He had taken a seat, not at the big table, but at the smaller one near the stove, the one she used for preparation overflow, and that had 1 chair beside it, which was where he'd sat, which she noticed because it was a chair that placed him slightly separate from the main tables, which was either unconscious or deliberate, and in either case said something about how he understood his own position in this room. He looked at his coffee cup. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About the hotel." He looked up. "It's not working, the dining room. It hasn't been working since October, and I've known it longer than I've admitted it." He set the cup down. "I spent most of the storm working through what that means going forward." Mabel said nothing. "I'm closing the dining room," he said, "permanently." She had known this was coming, in the way you know certain things are structurally inevitable once the conditions have been in place long enough. But hearing it stated plainly, in Silas Varden's voice, in her kitchen, was still a different thing than knowing it abstractly. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her with a brief expression of surprise that he didn't fully suppress. "You don't need to be." "I know I don't," she said. "I am anyway." He was quiet for a moment. "I have guests at the hotel," he said. "Travelers passing through, sometimes small parties, occasionally a businessman staying a night or 2. I'll still have guests even without a dining room." He looked at his hands. "I'd like to send them to you, formally. A written arrangement, if you're willing. I refer hotel guests to your kitchen for their meals. You accommodate them as you're able." Mabel considered this. "No special treatment," she said. "They eat what everyone else eats. They wait if there's a wait." "Understood." "And the arrangement doesn't give you any say in what I cook or how I run this kitchen." "I'm not asking for that." She looked at him steadily. "Then yes," she said. "I'm willing." He nodded. He looked like he might say something else and didn't. He drank his coffee slowly, taking longer than he needed to, and she understood that he was not quite ready to leave and was not entirely sure why, and she didn't push him toward the door. She went back to the stove and finished the noon service, and Silas Varden sat at the small table near the stove with his coffee and watched, not intrusively but with the focused attention of a man seeing something clearly for the first time that he had been looking at for months. When the rush thinned and the second room was mostly empty and Nell was washing and Jasper was stacking, Silas stood and put his hat on and came to stand at the counter. "You put a second stove in," he said, looking at the far wall. "In December, before the storm." He looked at the stove, at Calder's earlier work on the firebox door, at the shelves she'd built, at the clay custard pots lined up on the back shelf. He looked at the second room through the doorway, at the long table and the benches Cork had made, at the pine board walls Mabel had hung with a few simple things, a square of cloth she'd brought from Missouri, a small piece of worked iron Calder had made for her, a hook rack that Jasper had assembled himself from mismatched hardware and presented to her one morning without explanation. "This place," Silas said, and stopped. She waited. "I told the men at the freight depot you'd be serving through the storm," he said, "in case any of them hadn't found their way here yet." He looked at the counter. "I should have said so. I didn't." "It's said now," she told him. He put his hat on fully and went to the door. He paused with his hand on the canvas. "The plates," he said. "I have china at the hotel. Good china, full service. I've been eating off it alone for 3 months." He didn't look back. "I'll bring some by, if you want it." She thought of her mismatched tin plates, the accumulated collection of whatever she'd been able to find and afford, serviceable and sufficient, and never anything she'd thought about as a representation of something. "I'd be glad of it," she said. He went out. She stood at the stove for a moment. Then Nell appeared in the doorway from the second room with an empty pot and looked at Mabel with the particular expression she wore when she had observed something and was deciding whether to comment on it. "Well," Nell said. "Don't," Mabel said. "I wasn't going to say anything." "You were absolutely going to say something," Nell set the pot down. I was going to say, she said, with careful precision, that I think it went better than it could have. That's all. Mabel looked at her. That's genuinely all I was going to say, Nell said. Mabel picked up the pot and started washing it. The road cleared on the 29th, 2 days after Lars had estimated, which Mabel noted as evidence that Lars's optimism was a reliable variable to account for in planning. The freight wagons began moving again on the 30th, slowly at first, one or two at a time, testing the packed surface. And by New Year's, the traffic through Cinder Ridge was back to its pre-storm volume and climbing. Because there had been a storm, and because word had continued to spread through the weeks before the storm, and had had nowhere to go during the storm, and had simply accumulated like water behind a dam. And when the road opened, it came through with the force of that accumulation. Golt had talked. His 4 men had talked. The survey crew that had rerouted through Cinder Ridge in November had talked at their winter camp to men who would move in spring and needed to know which routes were worth the additional miles. The lumber operation north of the ridge was establishing itself, which meant workers, which meant supply runs, which meant communication between here and the larger settlements to the east, which meant more people in transit who had heard a thing from a man who'd heard it from another man. 40 miles was no longer the outside edge of how far people were traveling. Mabel understood this when she began turning people away, not at 1 o'clock but at noon, and then at 11:30 on a Thursday in the first week of January, and then on a Tuesday, her traditionally slowest day. She had a full second room and was rationing coffee from 10 in the morning. She sat down that Tuesday evening after service with Nell and a piece of paper and did the numbers seriously for the first time. She needed more seating. She needed more storage. She needed more prep time, which meant she needed to shift her schedule earlier, which meant she needed Jasper earlier, which meant she needed to think about whether Jasper could manage what she was going to need him to manage, and whether it was appropriate to ask it of a 10-year-old. She needed, and this was the part of the list she'd been avoiding, help in a more formal and consistent way than Nell's current arrangement provided. She needed to pay Nell a real wage. She had the money to do it. That was the fact she had to sit with for a moment, because it was the kind of fact that had not been available to her since before James died. And even before that, it had been a conditional fact. Money available if certain other things were also true. Money that depended on the farm's season, or the store's month, or the particular set of circumstances that could change without warning and frequently did. This money was different. It came every day, in small amounts that added up to something dependable, and it came from people choosing to spend it here, which meant it was connected to something she could actually control. She told Nell what she was proposing. Nell looked at the numbers on the paper. She looked at them for a full minute without saying anything, and Mabel let her look because Nell was not a person you rushed through a calculation. "This is fair," Nell finally said. "I want it to be more than fair," Mabel said. "When the spring trade comes through, we revisit it." Nell looked up at her. "All right," she said. Then, "The expansion. I've been thinking about it." "The back of the freight shed," Nell said. "The north section. Cork could frame it." "I've been thinking about Cork." "Cork will do it for meals and a fair wage," Nell said, with the confidence of a woman who has done her research. "He told Jasper he was interested, in case you were thinking about it." Mabel looked at her. "Did everyone in this town discuss this before I did?" "Jasper mentioned it to Cork. Cork mentioned it to me. I didn't bring it to you until now because you had enough to manage." Nell folded her hands on the table with the composed authority of a woman who sees nothing unreasonable about any of this. "We're telling you now." Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Talk to Cork." The conversation with Calder happened not in the kitchen but at the smithy, which was where she went on the morning of the 2nd of January, because she needed to talk to him about the flue extension for the expanded space, and because she had been not going to the smithy for several weeks on grounds that were practical, and also, if she was honest, slightly less than fully practical. The smithy was warm in the dense, particular way of a space where a forge runs most of the day. Not the comfortable warmth of a kitchen, but a deeper, more fundamental heat that you felt in your bones before you felt it on your skin. Calder was working at the anvil when she came in, and he looked up and set his hammer down and waited, which was what he did when someone arrived who he thought had something to say. She laid out what she needed. The north section of the freight shed, the framing Cork was going to do, the additional flue work to bring a third stove into the expanded space at a later date, the structural questions about load and ventilation that she'd been working through and that she needed his specific knowledge to answer. He listened. He asked 4 questions, specific, technical, exactly the right questions. He walked with her back to the freight shed and looked at the north wall and the ceiling joists and the existing chimney run, and she stood beside him while he worked through it, and she was aware, standing there, of the specific combination of his proximity and his silence, and the way he moved through a physical space with the unconscious confidence of a man who understands how structures work at a foundational level. She was aware of all of this in the way you are aware of something you have been aware of for some time, but have been treating as background noise rather than information. He told her what the flu work would require. He told her the timeline. He told her what it would cost. She said yes. He nodded. They stood at the north wall of the freight shed in the January cold, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Calder said, not looking at her but at the wall, "I missed Tuesday." "I know," she said. "The freeze had the bellows mechanism jammed. I didn't get it clear until late." "You don't need to explain," she said. He looked at her then. The light in the freight shed at that hour came through the south window at an angle that was clear and cold and very direct, and she met his eyes and didn't look away. And what passed between them in that moment was not a declaration and not a question, but something that had the quality of both, an acknowledgement of something that had been present for some time, and that both of them had been treating as background noise. "I'll be there this Tuesday," he said. "Good," she said. That was the entirety of it. They walked back to the alley, he went back to the smithy, she went back to the kitchen. Nell was at the stove and didn't look up when Mabel came in. Jasper was stacking wood beside the second stove and also didn't look up. Mabel put on her apron and began the prep for the noon service and said nothing. The china arrived on a Wednesday. Silas Varden carried it himself. Not Hessler, not a hired man, but Silas personally, in a wooden crate that was large enough to require both arms and that he carried from the hotel to her kitchen in 2 trips with the focused, slightly awkward physicality of a man who is not accustomed to carrying things and is determined not to let this show. Mabel was serving 3 customers when he came through the door the first time. She pointed at the counter with her chin, and he set the crate there, went back for the second one, and by the time he returned, she had a moment between orders. She opened the first crate. The plates were bone china, cream-colored, with a narrow border pattern in deep blue around the rim, proper dinner plates and soup bowls and side plates, a full service for 12. They were in good condition, not new, but cared for, the kind of china that had been washed carefully and stored correctly and had not been allowed to chip or crack from carelessness. She lifted one of the dinner plates and held it in both hands. It was, she thought, the finest dish she had ever personally owned. She set it down carefully. "These are good pieces," she said. "They came from Chicago," Silas said, "when I opened the hotel." He looked at the plates. "They've been sitting in the cabinet." He paused. "A place like yours deserves proper plates." She looked at him. He said it without performance. No grandeur, no emphasis, just the plain statement of a man who has finally gotten around to saying something accurate. She said, "Thank you, Silas." It was the first time she had used his given name. He looked briefly startled, not offended, just caught off guard, the way people are caught off guard by the small markers of a change in relationship that they hadn't fully tracked until it arrived. "You're welcome, Wosam," he said. He looked at the crate. "There are cups in the second crate, coffee cups, proper ones. Not the hotel's best, but good." She opened the second crate. 8 coffee cups, cream china with the same blue border, with saucers. She set one on the preparation surface and looked at it. Lars Fenwick was going to have opinions about drinking coffee from a china cup with a saucer. She was going to have opinions about Lars Fenwick having opinions. "Sit down," she said to Silas. "Have breakfast." He sat. She fed him what she fed everyone that morning: potato cakes, beef stew from the night's slow cook, bread, coffee. She put his coffee in one of the new china cups, which she did deliberately and without comment. He looked at the cup. He picked it up by the handle. The kitchen was busy by then. 6 men at the tables, Nell moving between the rooms, Jasper carrying a pot of coffee with his tongue slightly out in concentration. Silas Varden sat at the small table near the stove, the one he'd sat at before, and he ate among freight drivers and ranch hands and a young lumberman who'd come in from the north operation. And he was not the most powerful man in the room or the wealthiest or the one anyone was particularly watching. He was just a man having breakfast. When he finished, he sat for an extra few minutes with his coffee, with his china cup, which he held with both hands the way Calder held cups, a thing she noticed and found faintly amusing. And he looked at the room with an expression she had not seen on his face before. She couldn't name it precisely. It wasn't contentment and it wasn't peace, because those were the kinds of words that suggested something settled, and Silas Varden was not settled yet and probably wouldn't be for some time. But it was something in that general direction. A man in a room where he was not the center and was not being feared and was not performing anything, and discovering that this was unexpectedly not the worst thing. Holt came in halfway through Silas's second cup and sat at the bench and looked at Silas and looked at his coffee cup and then looked at Mabel with the expression of a man who is prepared to have opinions about this situation. Mabel gave him coffee in a china cup before he could say anything. He looked at the cup. He looked at Mabel. He drank the coffee. He didn't say anything. By the third week of January, the china had become simply the china. The plates Mabel's customers ate off, the cups they drank from, unremarked upon, except by new arrivals, who occasionally looked at a cream and blue plate with mild surprise before sitting down and getting on with eating. Cork had started framing the north section. The work was loud and intermittent. Cork worked on the expansion in the hours when the kitchen was between services, which was its own kind of scheduling challenge, and the noise of hammering and sawing became a background feature of the kitchen's afternoon hours that everyone adapted to without much discussion. Jasper had developed the habit of watching Cork work during the lulls between his kitchen duties. He watched with the same expression he used when watching Mabel cook, not idle curiosity but systematic attention, the look of someone building an internal inventory of how things were done. Cork, who was not a demonstrative man but was apparently not impervious to a 10-year-old's focused interest, had begun occasionally explaining what he was doing while he did it. Mabel noticed this without comment. She noticed a lot of things she didn't comment on, which was, she had come to understand, one of the more useful skills she possessed. What she did comment on, one morning in the third week of January, when Lars came in with 2 new men she hadn't seen before and a story that had the particular quality of being significant, was what Lars said after he'd introduced the men and settled in with his coffee. The men were named Aldous and Price, and they were, Lars explained, advance riders for a cattle company out of the South, a company that was routing a substantial spring drive through the Northern Territories and needed to identify reliable stopping points along the route. Reliable meaning not just passable, but genuinely capable of feeding a large number of working men on a consistent basis. They had heard about Mabel's kitchen from Galt. They had come, Aldous explained in a careful, businesslike way that told her he'd done this kind of assessment before, to see whether the kitchen could handle volume and consistency, and what the arrangement for a large party would look like. Mabel looked at Aldous. She looked at Price. She looked at the kitchen that she had built from nothing in a ruined freight shed over the course of one Wyoming winter with $43 and 1 skillet, and the help of people who had shown up because she'd given them reason to. "How many men?" she said. "First drive, 32, Aldous said. "Possibly a second group of similar size, 3 weeks behind." 32 men. The number sat in the room for a moment. "That's more than my seating," she said. "I'd need to do it in shifts, or set up outside if the weather's right. What's the timing?" "Late April? Early May?" She thought about the expansion, Cork's framing, the additional seating she'd be adding. By late April, with the north section framed and fitted, she'd have seating for 34, possibly 36. "I can do it," she said. "1 sitting for the first group, bring them in by rotation. 2 sittings if the weather holds, and I can set boards outside." "What are you paying?" They discussed terms. Aldous was a practical negotiator. No theatrics, no pressure, just clear parameters and genuine interest in arriving at something workable. Price took notes in a small book. By the time both men had finished their coffee and their potato cakes, they had an agreement in principle that they would confirm by letter within 2 weeks. When they left, Lars sat back and looked at Mabel with the expression he'd been wearing more and more frequently over the past months. The look of a man who had watched something happen that he'd believed in before most other people had believed in it, and who took a quiet, specific satisfaction in having been right. 32 men, he said. "Don't," she said. "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying," she said, "and I'll worry about it in April. Right now I have 11 people waiting on stew." He grinned into his coffee cup and didn't say anything else. She went back to the stove. February arrived the way February arrives in Wyoming. Not worse than January in temperature, but more wearing in a cumulative way, the cold having gone on long enough that people had stopped adapting to it and started simply enduring it. The road continued clear, the traffic continued growing. Cork finished the north section framing and she fitted it out over the course of a week, moving the furniture she'd had built by increments, acquiring 2 more pine tables from a man who was liquidating a boarding house operation 20 miles east, finding chairs where she could. She had seating for 31 now. On a full service, she was feeding 40 to 45 people across 2 sittings. She stood at the stove one morning in the second week of February, the kitchen running at full capacity around her. Nell at the second stove, Jasper moving between the rooms with a full coffee pot, Cork eating his breakfast before starting the day's remaining finish work on the north wall. And she looked at the room, at all of it, at the 2 stoves and the full tables and the china plates and the cups hanging from Jasper's hook rack and the shelf she'd built and the door Calder had made and the space that had been a ruined, empty wreck 4 months ago. She had not thought, arriving in Cinder Ridge, that she was building something. She had thought she was surviving. Those 2 things had turned out to be the same thing, which she supposed she should have known but hadn't, not fully, not until it was already built around her. Calder came in at 8:30, before the main rush, which was unusual. He sat at his end of the table and she poured his coffee, and he didn't start drinking it immediately, which meant he had something to say and was working out how to begin. She waited. "There's a name," he said. She looked at him. "Above the door." He kept his eyes on his coffee. "Every place that's worth finding has a name above the door. People coming from 40 miles out, they need something to call it when they're telling the next man where to stop." She thought about this. "I hadn't thought about a name," she said. "I know." He picked up the coffee. "I thought about it." "And?" He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Rourke's," he said, simply, just that. She stood at the stove and looked at him and thought about $43 and 1 skillet and a ruined kitchen and 4 months and everything that had happened in between. "Rourke's," she said. "Just that," he said. "No need for anything else." She nodded. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a piece of iron, flat, worked carefully into letters that she recognized as his best work. The letters clean and even and carried through with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything he built. Rourkes. He had made it already, before asking her. He had made it because he'd already decided it was right, and he was not a man who waited to act on a decision once he'd made it. She took it from him and held it in both hands. The iron was cold from the outside air, but even cold, it had a weight and permanence to it that she felt in her palms. "When did you make this?" she asked. 2 weeks ago, he said. She looked at it. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said. He drank his coffee. She held the sign in her hands a moment longer, feeling the letters under her fingers. Her name, in iron, above a door she had rebuilt herself in a town that had given her its worst building and expected her to fail. She went to the door. She put the sign up herself, working the nail through the mounting hole Calder had drilled, hammering it into the door frame with 3 clean strokes. She stepped back and looked at it from the alley. It was not a grand sign. It was not painted or gilded or mounted on a proper board. It was a piece of worked iron with 7 letters on it, hung above a canvas door in an alley in a Wyoming settlement that most maps didn't bother to mark yet. It was exactly right. She went back inside. The morning service was starting. Nell had the second stove loaded. Jasper was already moving with the coffee pot. Cork had eaten and was back at the north wall with his tools, the sound of the finishing work a steady presence in the background. Mabel Rourke tied on her apron and went to work. The sign stayed up through February and into March, and Mabel stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing things that have become simply true. What she noticed instead, in the way a person notices the things that are changing faster than they can fully track, was the quality of who was coming through her door and what they were carrying with them when they arrived. In October it had been freight drivers, Lars and Cork, and Holt, and men like them, men whose work put them on the road and whose road happened to pass through Cinder Ridge. In November and December it had been more of the same, the circle widening outward from Lars's particular enthusiasm, spreading through the freight network the way information spreads through any network of people who see each other regularly and have things worth telling. But by March, the people coming through Rourke's door were different in a way she hadn't anticipated. Not just freight men, not just the survey crews and lumber workers and ranch hands who had always been there. There were families now, a husband and wife and 3 children who had come through on the 15th of March heading west. The wife so tired she sat at the bench and put both elbows on the table and said nothing for a full minute before she looked up and said quietly that she hadn't sat at a proper table in 11 days. There was a school teacher, a woman named Carver, who was traveling alone to a position 50 miles north and who ate with the careful, deliberate attention of someone who had been rationing for a long time and was trying not to show it. There was an older man who arrived one morning without explanation and sat at the end of the second room and ate 3 full plates and left enough money to cover 6 meals and never gave his name. Mabel fed all of them. What she was building, she understood by March, was not exactly a restaurant. It was not exactly a rest stop. It was something that didn't have a clean name yet in 1890 Wyoming, something that sat in the space between the two, a place where people who were between places could, for the duration of a meal, simply be somewhere. Not in transit, not on a road. Somewhere. She thought about this on a Sunday morning in mid-March, while Jasper was doing something with the water buckets that involved a pulley system he had apparently devised himself and was currently testing with the intensity of a small engineer. She thought about it, and she didn't have a clean conclusion about it, and she decided that was fine. Not everything needed a clean conclusion. Some things were simply what they were. And what this was evident in the quality of the silence at her tables. The specific settled silence of people who have been given something they needed and didn't have to ask for. Cork finished the north section in the last week of February, and the additional seating it provided, 9 places, bringing Rourke's to a full capacity of 40, had been necessary before the ink was dry on the arrangement with Aldous and Price. The cattle company letter arrived in the first week of March, confirming the late April drive and the terms they'd discussed, and Mabel folded it and put it in the coffee tin that had long since stopped being a place for savings and had become instead a kind of filing system for things she considered important. She showed it to Nell. Nell read it carefully, which she did with everything that was put in front of her. She folded it back along its creases and handed it to Mabel. "We need to think about the outside boards," Nell said. She meant the temporary tables Cork could build for the yard behind the kitchen. Boards on sawhorses that would extend the seating into the open air for the single service when 32 cattlemen came through, assuming the weather held, which in late April Wyoming was not a guarantee but was a reasonable probability. "I talked to Cork," Mabel said. "He's already thinking about the sawhorses." "Of course he is," Nell said, without particular surprise. It had become a running quality of the situation. The things Mabel thought she needed to initiate had already been initiated by someone in her orbit before she got there. Nell anticipated the cooking needs. Cork anticipated the structural ones. Jasper, in his particular way, anticipated the things that fell between those categories and seemed to require no specific skill except willingness and observation, both of which he had in surplus. She told Calder about the cattle company arrangement on a Tuesday evening. He listened with his hands around his coffee cup, one of the china cups with the blue border, which he had adopted without comment sometime in late January. And when she finished, he said, "That's 32 men in one service. Rotating 2 or 3 sittings. Still." "I know." He looked at the cup. "You'll need another hand. Someone to carry plates in the second room when Jasper's on the coffee and Nell's at the stoves." She had been thinking about this. There were limited candidates in Cinder Ridge itself. It was a small settlement, and most of the people in it were already occupied. But she had heard from Nell that a young woman named Dora, whose family had come through in February and settled 6 miles out, was looking for work and had mentioned Rourke specifically. She told Calder about Dora. He nodded. "Worth talking to her." "I plan to." He looked at her over the rim of the cup. "I know," he said. "I'm agreeing with you." She almost smiled. "I'm aware of that." This was the texture of their Tuesday evenings now. These conversations that moved between the practical and something that was not quite the practical, that occasionally arrived at a sentence or a look that was clearly about neither the second stove nor the cattle company arrangement, and that both of them managed without defining or rushing. It was, she thought, the right pace for 2 people who had each spent significant portions of their lives learning not to be careless with what mattered. She spoke to Dora in the second week of March. The young woman was 19, quiet in the way of someone who was genuinely attentive rather than shy, and she had the specific quality Mabel had learned to look for in people who would work well in a busy kitchen. She moved without colliding. Not gracefully, not with any particular elegance, but with the practical spatial awareness of someone who had grown up in close quarters and knew how to be in a room without being an obstacle in it. She started the following Monday. By the end of her first week, Mabel had concluded that Dora was going to be fine, and by the end of her second week, she had concluded that fine was an underestimate. Dora had a memory for faces that bordered on the unnerving. She remembered every returning customer's usual order after hearing it once and began preparing before being asked, which saved time in a way that was small per instance and significant across a full service. She also, Mabel noticed, had a way with the difficult customers, the ones who came in surly from a bad road or a bad night, and needed something that was not quite patience and not quite management, but something in between, a particular quality of being seen without being fussed over that settled most men down inside of 5 minutes. "Where did you learn that?" Mabel asked her one afternoon. Dora looked up from the plates she was stacking. "My father," she said simply. "He was like that sometimes. You just had to not make it worse." Mabel looked at her for a moment. "You're good at this," she said. Dora looked briefly uncertain, the expression of someone who has been told something accurate and doesn't quite know how to hold it yet. "I like it," she said. "I like the—" She paused, searching for the word. "The pace of it. There's always something to do, and you can see when you've done it right." Mabel understood this precisely. It was stripped to its essentials, why she had cooked her entire life. Not for the praise, though the praise was real and mattered more than she always admitted, but for that specific satisfaction of a thing done correctly that produced a visible result. The plate that came back clean. The bowl held a moment longer than necessary. The customer who sat still for a few seconds after finishing, not ready to stand up yet, not because they were tired, but because they weren't ready to leave something that was good. "Yes," she told Dora. "That's it exactly." March moved into April with the particular impatience of a Wyoming spring, which was not the gentle warming of other climates but a negotiation. Cold mornings and warm afternoons and mud that was profound and unrelenting, and that Jasper tracked into the kitchen no matter how many times he was reminded to stamp his boots at the door. The freight traffic was at its heaviest of the year. The lumber operation north of the ridge was in full expansion, bringing crews through twice a week. The survey company that had rearranged its routes the previous autumn sent a new crew that had heard about the old crew's experience and arrived with specific expectations that Mabel took as information and not pressure. She served them what she served everyone. If they'd come for something specific, they left with something better. Silas Varden came to Rourke's 3 mornings a week now, a pattern that had established itself without discussion sometime in February, and that had become simply a fact of those mornings. The way the second stove's slightly louder draft was a fact, or the way Jasper's arrival at 6:15 was a fact. He sat at the small table near the stove and drank his coffee from a china cup and ate what was served and observed the operation with the specific attention of a man who understood business and was watching one be conducted very well. He did not offer advice. This was important to Mabel, and she thought he understood that, though neither of them had said it. He had spent a significant portion of his life in Cinder Ridge being the person whose opinion shaped what other people did, and he was learning. She could see him learning it. Not gracefully, not all at once, but incrementally and genuinely. That there were situations in which his role was simply to be present without directing anything. He was better at it than she would have expected in October. He was still not entirely good at it. There were moments when she could see the old impulse rise in him. When the service was running heavy and something was taking longer than it should, when a supply arrangement seemed to her to call for a different approach than the one she was using, and she watched him actively choose not to say it, which was not the same as not thinking it, and which cost him something she could see it cost him. She respected him more for the effort than she would have for the success. Success was easy to respect. Effort was where character actually lived. One morning in early April, on a Thursday when the kitchen was unusually quiet, a road closure 20 miles south had slowed the freight traffic, and only 4 customers had come through by 10 o'clock. Silas sat at his small table with his second cup of coffee and said, without preamble, "Pruitt wants to talk to you." Mabel looked up. "About what?" The supply arrangement. He's been getting pressure from the Eastern suppliers, the ones I used to use for the hotel, and he thinks there might be a better deal available if he's buying for both your operation and the hotel's basic needs together. Silas turned his cup. You'd need to coordinate on some items, not everything, but flour, coffee, the dried goods. She thought about this. Pruitt had been fair with her since November. The previous incident with the supply lockout had apparently affected him in a way he hadn't fully articulated, but that had expressed itself in a consistent and slightly over-careful scrupulousness in his dealings with her since. A joint arrangement with the hotel would give her purchasing leverage she didn't currently have alone. I'll talk to him, she said. Silas nodded. He looked at his cup. You'd be dealing with me indirectly, through Pruitt's orders. I'm aware of that. I want you to know I understand what that might look like, he said. Given the history, she looked at him directly. Silas, if I thought you were going to interfere with my supplies again, I wouldn't consider it for 30 seconds. She turned back to the stove. I don't think that, so I'll talk to Pruitt. He was quiet for a moment. Thank you, he said. Don't thank me. It's practical. It's both, he said. She didn't argue with that. The meeting with Aldous and Price happened in the third week of April, when the two men came through again ahead of the drive to confirm logistics. They sat at the second room's long table with Mabel and went through the arrangements, timing, menu, the outside boards Cork had built and waterproofed, the additional water hauling Jasper had organized with a neighbor boy for the day. Price took notes in his small book. Aldous asked 3 questions, all of them the right questions, and seemed satisfied with the answers. Word's gotten around, Aldous said before they left. About the food here. I've had 3 men on the drive specifically ask whether we were coming through Cinder Ridge. Specifically? Mabel said. By name, Aldous said. Rourke's. She heard her name in his mouth, her name on a sign above a door, her name in the mouths of men she'd never met, men who had heard it from other men along roads she would never travel. And she sat with that for a moment. She had not set out to be known. She had set out to cook and survive. The knowing was what happened when you did the first 2 things well enough and long enough. Tell them there'll be potato cakes, she said. Aldous almost smiled. I'll tell them. The drive came through on the 28th of April. It arrived not as 32 men, but as 36. The drive had picked up 4 additional hands at a ranch 20 miles south, Aldous explained as he came through the door ahead of the group, and he was sorry for the short notice, but he'd pay the rate for the additional 4. Mabel looked at 36 trail-worn men standing in her yard in the thin April sunshine and thought about her 40 seats inside and Cork's boards outside and the quantity of beef that had been on the stove since 3 in the morning. 3 sittings, she said to Nell, coming back through the kitchen door. Already adjusted, Nell said. Of course she had. The first sitting was 12 men on the outside boards, those who didn't mind the cold, the ones who'd been on the trail so long that sitting on a board in April sunshine was a luxury by comparison. The second sitting was the inside rooms, all 40 seats. The third sitting was the remaining 12, back on the outside boards as the first group finished, and the weather remained cooperative enough. It was the hardest service Rourke's had ever run. Mabel was at the stove from 3 in the morning to past 2 in the afternoon. She lost track of time in the middle of it. The way you lose track of time inside something that requires all of you. Not unpleasantly, not in a frightening way, but in the way of a current that you're moving with rather than against, that carries you through something that would be impossible to think your way through, but that the body manages if the body knows what it's doing and trusts itself. Her body knew what it was doing. Nell was extraordinary that day. There was no other word for it. She moved between both stoves with an efficiency that went beyond skill into something closer to instinct. Reading the pace of service and adjusting output without being told. Communicating with Mabel through glances and small gestures that had become, over months of working in the same room, a shared language neither of them had formally learned. Dora moved through the rooms with the quiet competence that had become her baseline, and the neighbor boy Jasper had recruited. A 12-year-old named Willis, who was slightly less reliable than Jasper but significantly stronger, hauled water without stopping for 4 hours and did not once complain about it. Jasper was everywhere. That was the only accurate description. He appeared where things were needed before the need was formally identified, which was a quality Mabel had stopped trying to explain and had simply come to rely on as a feature of how Rourke's operated. When the last of the 36 men finished, and the outside boards were cleared and Aldous settled the account, he overpaid, deliberately, in the way of a man making a statement about value rather than simply fulfilling an obligation. Mabel stood at the back of the kitchen and put both hands flat on the preparation surface and breathed. Nell was washing. Dora was stacking plates, china plates, cream and blue, 40 of them, plus the service pieces. Willis had gone home with his wages. Jasper was sweeping the second room with the focused thoroughness he brought to everything, pushing the broom into the corners, getting the edges that most people missed. Calder appeared in the kitchen doorway at 2:30. He had not been part of the day's service. He had his own work, the smithy, obligations that didn't pause for Rourke's big days. But he was here now, and he stood in the doorway and looked at the kitchen, at Nell at the sink and Dora with the plates, and Jasper in the second room, and Mabel with her hands on the preparation surface. And his expression was the one she had learned to read over many months of Tuesday evenings and Sunday mornings and shared silences. 36, he said. 36, she confirmed. He came in and sat at the end of the table, and Mabel poured him coffee. There was barely half a pot left, and the coffee was at the strong, slightly bitter end of a pot that had been sitting for an hour, and she gave it to him without apology because it was what there was, and he drank it without comment. They sat in the quiet of the kitchen after the storm of the day, and the quiet had a specific quality, not emptiness, but fullness of a different kind, the way a room feels after something real has happened in it. Aldous is going to tell people, Calder said. He already is, she said. He was talking to 2 men at the freight depot before his wagons cleared the yard. Calder nodded. He turned his cup. Second drive is 3 weeks out. 40 men, maybe, she said. Price mentioned it in passing. He looked at the north wall. The expansion Cork had built. The 9 additional seats, the second stove, installed in December. He looked at it with the measuring eye of a man who was already thinking about what came after 40. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Not today, she said. Let me have today. He picked up his cup. Fair enough, he said. She had today. The second cattle drive came through on the 19th of May, and it was 41 men, and Mabel ran it in 4 sittings with Cork's boards expanded to accommodate 15 outside. And it went more smoothly than the first because they had run the first and knew where the friction was. Nell had pre-portioned everything the night before. Dora had recruited Willis again, and also Willis's older sister, a capable 14-year-old named Ada, who turned out to be significantly more reliable than her brother. Jasper had reorganized the water hauling system so that there was never a gap between when a pot needed filling and when it was filled. After the drive left, Lars Fenwick sat at the bench with his coffee and said, There's going to be a third. Aldous told me, Mabel said. There's also going to be a road survey team coming through in June, 20 men. I know about the survey team. And there's a family, the Holloways, settling 6 miles north, and I heard they're expecting maybe 10 more families through the summer, and they'll all come through Cinder Ridge. Lars, I'm just telling you what I'm hearing on the road. I know what you're telling me, she said. I'm managing it. He looked around the kitchen, at the expansion, at the 2 stoves, at the organization that had developed over 8 months from a scraped-out, exhausted improvisation into something that ran with the efficiency of something genuinely well-designed. He looked at the sign she'd had Cork mount more permanently above the real wooden door that had replaced the canvas 3 months ago. Rourke's 7 iron letters, nothing else. I want you to know something, Lars said. She looked at him. When I walked in here the first time, he stopped, started again, the way he sometimes did when he was being careful about something. You had 4 chairs and a stove that barely worked, and you were cooking beef and eggs on it like it was a proper kitchen. He turned his cup. I knew then. I told Davies that night. I said that woman is going to feed half the territory before winter's out. Mabel said nothing. Davies said I was being dramatic, Lars said. You were probably being somewhat dramatic, she said. I was right. You were partially right, she said. It was a long winter. He grinned. That it was. He finished his coffee and left, and Mabel stood at the preparation surface for a moment after he went out. She was 55 years old. She had turned 55 in March, quietly, on a Wednesday morning between the first and second service, and Nell had produced a small cake at the end of the day from ingredients she had clearly been assembling for days. A proper layer cake with dried fruit filling and a brown sugar glaze set on one of the china plates. Jasper had stood beside it with the expression of a person who has kept a secret for longer than is entirely comfortable and is relieved to be released from it. Dora had been there. Calder had been there. It had been a very small gathering in a kitchen that smelled like the end of a long day, and the cake had been genuinely good. Nell's work, careful and precise. And Mabel had eaten her piece at the end of the table she had built and looked at the people in the room, and she had thought, this is the thing, not the money, not the 40 seats or the 2 stoves or the china plates or the sign above the door, not even the people who traveled 40 miles to sit at her tables, though that was real and it meant something and she didn't discount it. This. The people in this room on a Wednesday evening eating cake. The particular collection of people who had found their way to this kitchen and stayed. She thought about that now, in the quieter morning of late May, with summer coming and the 3rd cattle drive on its way, and the survey team after that and whatever came after that, and she thought about what it meant to build something. She had not set out to change Cinder Ridge. She had not arrived with a vision or a mission or a plan. She had arrived with $43 and a skillet and nowhere left to go, and she had looked at a ruined kitchen and decided she would rather work in it than leave. That was the whole of the original decision, that simple and that unstrategic. What she had learned, what 8 months in a broken-down freight shed had taught her with the specificity of lived experience rather than the abstraction of wisdom, was that the decision to stay and work was not a small decision. It looked small. It felt small. In the moment. The way most important decisions feel small in the moment and only reveal their weight over time. But staying and working in a place that told you to leave was an act that had consequences that rippled outward in ways you couldn't predict and didn't fully control, and sometimes couldn't even see until you looked back from some distance. She had stayed. She had cooked. She had refused to retaliate when retaliation would have been justified, and refused to become cruel when cruelty would have been easy. And the cumulative effect of those decisions, not dramatic decisions, not heroic ones, just consistent ones, was a kitchen where 36 cattlemen could be fed in an afternoon, and a 10-year-old boy had found his second home, and a proud, difficult man had learned to sit among ordinary people without requiring that they make room for his importance. That was not nothing. That was, she thought, in fact, the whole of it. In the first week of June, on a Tuesday morning that arrived warm and clear, with the kind of light that makes Wyoming look like it was apologizing for winter, Silas Varden came into Rourke's at 9:30 and sat at his usual small table and then, after a moment, did something he had never done before. He moved to the main table. He sat at the bench between a young ranch hand named Ivers, who was eating his second plate of potato cakes, and old Briggs, the rancher who had been coming in twice a week since November, and who had, over those months, graduated from surly suspicion to a kind of grumbling regularity that Mabel interpreted as affection. Silas sat between them, and Mabel brought him coffee, in his china cup, blue border, which she had stopped thinking of as his china and started thinking of simply as the china. And he said good morning to Briggs, and Briggs said good morning. Back in the voice of a man for whom saying good morning to Silas Varden was a thing he'd never expected to do and was managing with minimal ceremony. Evers, who was 23 and had no particular history with Silas, and therefore no particular barrier to simple courtesy, offered to pass the bread. Silas took a piece of bread. Dora brought his plate, potato cakes, beef, the roasted onions that had become a permanent part of the morning service because enough customers had asked where they went when she occasionally left them off. Silas ate. He ate at the bench among the ranch hand and the rancher and 2 freight drivers Mabel didn't know by name yet, and nobody made a particular fuss about it, and nobody treated him with the wary deference they had once given him, and nobody asked him for anything, and he sat in the middle of all of that ordinariness with his plate and his coffee and his piece of bread, and he looked, for the first time since Mabel had known him, like a man who was in the right place. After breakfast, when most of the others had gone, and the kitchen was moving into the quieter mid-morning before the lunch service, Silas remained at the main table with his coffee. Mabel was at the preparation surface working on the noon batch, and the kitchen had the comfortable quality it had on mornings when the pace allowed for something other than pure management. "I had a letter," Silas said. She looked up, from my brother in Denver. He turned his cup. "He's been asking me to come down and look at a business venture he's interested in. Hotel property, in the city. He thinks I have relevant experience. A pause. He's been asking for a while. Are you going? She asked. I'm thinking about it. He looked at the table. Not permanently, but possibly for a few months in the autumn, once the summer traffic settles. She considered what this would mean, practically. The hotel here operating with reduced supervision, the referral arrangement for guests needing to run through Hessler, the supply coordination with Pruitt that had been working well and would need to continue without Silas present to manage his side of it. The arrangement with Pruitt can hold without you here, she said. Hessler knows the hotel's needs. I know. He looked at her. That's not what I'm asking. She stopped working and looked at him properly. I'm asking, he said carefully, whether you think it's... He stopped. Tried again. I've been in Cinder Ridge for 19 years. I came here when it was 3 buildings and a freight stop, and I built something that I thought was going to last. He was quiet. It didn't last the way I thought it was going to. No, she said. But it lasted. He looked at her. The hotel's still standing, she said. People are still sleeping in it. You still own it. What didn't last was the particular idea you had about how things here were going to arrange themselves. She picked up her knife and went back to the prep. That's different from the thing itself. He was quiet for a moment. My brother thinks I've lost my edge, he said. That's not quite what he says, but it's what he means. What do you think? I think, Silas said slowly, that I may have simply changed what I'm using it on. She looked at him over the preparation surface. He met her eyes, and in them she saw something she had not seen in the man who had sat across a mahogany desk and slid a doubled rent toward her in October. Something that was not softness exactly, because Silas Varden would never quite arrive at softness, but something adjacent to it, something that looked like a man who has had a long argument with himself and has finally, reluctantly, come to terms with what he lost and what he gained in the exchange. Go to Denver, she said. See your brother. He nodded slowly. And tell him, she added, that your edge is fine. It's just pointed at something different now. He almost smiled. It was a better almost smile than the one he'd given her in October, which had been the almost smile of a man who is certain of his own advantage. This one was the almost smile of a man who is uncertain of a great many things and finds this, cautiously, less terrible than expected. He finished his coffee and left. Jasper appeared from the second room where he'd been sweeping and stood in the doorway with his broom. He's going to Denver? He asked. You were listening, Mabel said. I was in the next room, he said, with the complete absence of apology of a 10-year-old who sees nothing wrong with this. He might go for a few months, she said, in autumn. Jasper considered this. The hotel's going to be a problem without him managing it. She looked at him. He was right. It was going to be a logistical challenge, and she had been thinking about it even while she was talking to Silas, because thinking about the next problem while managing the current one was simply how her mind worked now. I know, she said. You could talk to Hessler, Jasper said. He's more capable than people think. She looked at him more carefully. How do you know that? He fixed the south window of the hotel himself, in February, while the storm was happening. Jasper leaned the broom against the wall with the casualness of someone making a point. Nobody asked him to. He just did it because it needed doing. Mabel looked at Jasper for a moment. At the serious, capable face of a boy who paid attention to things other people didn't think to pay attention to, who filed information and used it and understood people with a clarity that had nothing to do with age. She was going to say something about him being too young to be this useful, but she didn't, because it wasn't true, and also because he wouldn't have known what to do with it. Good thinking, she said. I'll talk to Hessler. He picked up his broom and went back to sweeping. Summer arrived, and with it a volume of traffic through Cinder Ridge that none of them had quite anticipated, though in retrospect they should have, because word traveled the way word traveled, and Rourke's had been building its reputation through every month of the previous winter and spring, and now that reputation was mature enough to generate its own momentum. Travelers came who hadn't planned to come to Cinder Ridge at all, and had rerouted because someone on the road had told them there was a kitchen worth stopping for. Mabel expanded the outside seating permanently. Cork built proper tables with attached benches that could be moved inside in bad weather, and she covered the yard area with a canvas shade that Calder engineered from poles and stretched fabric and that kept the direct summer sun off the outside tables without blocking the breeze. She served outside through June and July and into August, and the combination of the inside rooms and the yard gave her a capacity that fluctuated between 45 and 60 depending on the day's mix of customers. And she managed this with the same principle she had applied since October. Cook what you have, cook it well, don't run short on the things that matter. She ran short occasionally. Not often, but occasionally. A day when the ostrom supply was delayed, a week when the beef quality from the new supplier was unreliable, and she refused to serve it and had to rebuild the menu around what she'd stored. These were not catastrophes. They were problems, and she solved them, and the customers who arrived on those days ate what was available and came back the next week for what wasn't. Calder built her a proper cold storage room in July, a small structure attached to the north wall, insulated with sawdust packed between double walls, deep enough in the shaded corner of the yard that the temperature stayed reliably low through the summer months. It was the single most useful structural improvement anyone had made to Rourke since the second stove, and she told him so. He said he'd been thinking about it since April. "Why didn't you say so in April?" she asked. "You had enough to think about in April," he said. She looked at him. "Calder." "Yes." "Stop deciding what I have enough capacity to think about." He looked at her with the steady, careful expression that was simply his way of being present. "Fair," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He picked up his hammer. "I was also thinking about a second cold room." She looked at him for a long moment. "Show me where," she said. The second cold room went in the following week. By September, Rourke's had been operating for 11 months. The iron sign above the door had weathered through a Wyoming winter and a Wyoming summer and had developed in both extremes the particular color of iron that has been exposed to real weather. Not rust exactly, but the deepening that comes from existing in a climate that tests things. Mabel had been asked twice if she wanted a proper painted sign, a board with lettering, something more visible from the freight road. She had said no both times. She did not need more visibility. What she had was people who knew where she was. On a Tuesday evening in the second week of September, an evening that was cooler than August but not yet cold, the kind of evening Wyoming produces in the weeks before it commits to autumn, when the light comes at a lower angle and the air has a clarity that makes everything look more defined. Calder came to Rourke's at his usual time and sat at the end of the main table and drank his coffee, and they talked through the week's logistics the way they always did. And then the logistics were done, and the kitchen was quiet, and there was the particular Tuesday evening quality to the room that Mabel had come to think of as one of the fixed, reliable things in her life. Calder set his cup down. He looked at the table for a moment. "I've been thinking," he said. "You're always thinking," she said, "but this is different." He looked up at her. "I'd like to not have to walk home on Tuesday evenings." She looked at him. He met her eyes with the steadiness that was simply his nature. No performance, no deflection, just a man saying a true thing in the clearest way he knew how. "I'm not asking for anything complicated," he said. "I'm not asking for anything dramatic. I'm just telling you that I'd rather be here than at the smithy on Tuesday evenings. And most other evenings." He looked at his hands. "And mornings. And He stopped. "Most of the time, Mabel." She was quiet. She thought about Missouri, about James, about the long and not uncomplicated life she had lived before Wyoming. She thought about October, about $43, about arriving in a place that didn't expect her and didn't want her, and hadn't believed she would stay. She thought about everything she had built in 11 months in a ruined kitchen, not just the stoves and the seats and the storage and the sign, but the things that didn't go on a ledger, the things that were real in a way that balance sheets couldn't contain. She thought about Calder Boone at the end of her table on a Tuesday evening, holding a coffee cup in both hands. "You should have said something sooner," she said. "Probably," he said. "We've wasted considerable time." "Some," he said. "Not all of it." She looked at him for a moment. "No," she agreed. "Not all of it." She poured him more coffee. He took the cup. They sat at the table in the quiet of the kitchen in the September evening, and there was nothing dramatic about it and nothing that needed to be announced to anyone and nothing that required a ceremony to make it real. It was real already. It had been real for some time. Silas left for Denver in October, on a cold Thursday morning, on a hired wagon that he'd arranged through Pruitt. He stopped at Rourke's before leaving, came in at 7, ate breakfast at the main table with Holt and a man named DeWitt who was passing through, drank his coffee from his china cup, left the exact right amount on the table, including what Mabel privately calculated was a significant overpayment that he would have been irritated if she'd pointed out. At the door he stopped. He turned back to the room, to Mabel at the stove and Nell at the second stove, and Dora moving through the second room and Jasper with the coffee pot and the two men at the table who didn't know or care who he was. "This place," he said, to no one in particular, and to all of them, "is the best thing in Cinder Ridge." Mabel looked at him from the stove. "Travel safely, Silas," she said. He put his hat on and went out. She heard the wagon start up through the kitchen walls, heard the sound of it on the freight road, heard it diminish and go. She turned back to the stove. Nell glanced at her. "He'll be back," she said. "I know," Mabel said, "probably with opinions about Denver's dining establishments." "Almost certainly," Mabel said. Nell turned back to her stove and didn't say anything else, and the kitchen ran on into the morning. Potato cakes, stew, roasted onions, coffee, in cream and blue china cups. The bread that Nell had doubled again because Tuesday had been full and Wednesday was trending the same way. Jasper set a pot down at the end of the main table and looked at Mabel with those careful, attentive eyes that had been cataloging everything she did for nearly a year now. "Are we full today?" he asked. She looked at the tables, looked at the rooms, looked at the two stoves and the cold storage and the sign above the door and the people moving through the space she had built from a ruin. "Not yet," she said, "but we will be by noon." He nodded and picked up his pot and went back to work. She went back to the stove. Outside, the freight road ran on in both directions through the Wyoming morning, and somewhere along it there were men who had eaten here and were telling other men what they'd eaten, and those men would tell others, and some of those others would eventually find their way to the iron sign above the door and come through and sit at one of the tables and eat what was served and leave, having been given something they hadn't known they were looking for. Not just food, something that had no better name than what it was. A place where you were fed and seen and could sit as long as the meal lasted without being required to be anyone other than who you were. Mabel Rourke had arrived in Cinder Ridge with $43, one skillet, and the knowledge that there was nothing left behind her worth going back to. She had been handed a ruined kitchen in an alley behind a freight shed, handed it by a man who expected her to fail, watched by a town that expected the same. She had not failed. Not because she was exceptional, not because she had been lucky, though luck had come into it, the way luck always comes into things when you stay long enough for it to find you. Not because she had been without fear, because she had been afraid plenty of times. Afraid in October when she counted her money in the dark and did the arithmetic. Afraid in November when the supplies disappeared and she stood at the pantry looking at what remained. Afraid in December in the snow. Walking toward a man's house to feed someone who had tried to ruin her because she could not, in the end, leave a sick person to manage alone. She had not failed because she had kept doing the one thing she knew how to do. In the one space she had managed to claim, one meal at a time, one customer at a time, without waiting for circumstances to be better or people to be easier or the road to smooth itself out before she committed to the work. That was the whole of it. That was, she thought, turning the heat down on the morning's second pot and reaching for the ladle and beginning the work of the day's first full service, more than enough.